Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're going somewhere far more perilous than any battlefield, any royal court, any pirate ship on the high seas. Tonight, we're walking into a private dining room on Fifth Avenue in the year 1885, where the only weapons are silverware and the only casualties are reputations. This is the Gilded Age, a strange, golden, overstuffed era in American history when a handful of families amassed more wealth than entire nations, and then spent that wealth building marble mansions just to invite each other over for dinner and quietly judge one another for 3 hours straight. It was an age of astonishing fortunes, built on railroads and steel and oil, and an age of astonishing pettiness, built on the exact fold of a calling card. If you're just settling in for the night, let this be your invitation to relax. Dim the lights. Get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop from wherever they've been living up near your ears all day. Tonight's story unfolds slowly, deliberately, the way a long formal dinner does course after course, rule after rule, and by the time we reach the end, you'll likely be long asleep, dreaming of oyster forks and marble staircases. Before we begin properly, a small thank you. This topic came from a listener request, and it's exactly the kind of oddly specific historical deep dive I love disappearing into. If there's a strange corner of history you'd like explored in this same slow, sleepy way, leave it in the comments. I read everyone, even if it takes me a while to get to it. Now, let's ask ourselves a question. Could you survive a single Gilded Age dinner party? Not the food, you could probably manage the eating part. I mean the rest of it. Could you follow rules that were never written down for you? Could you sit still for 3 or 4 hours in clothing designed to restrict your breathing? Could you make 3 hours of conversation without once mentioning your job, your opinions, or the weather back home? Could you tell the difference between 14 pieces of silverware laid out like a small silver battlefield in front of your plate? Probably not. And that's the whole point of tonight's journey. We're going to walk through an entire evening in high society New York, from the moment the invitation arrives to the moment you finally, mercifully, climb back into your carriage and go home. Every step of the way we'll pause and ask, would you have survived this? Almost certainly, the honest answer is no. Let's begin at the very beginning, because, in this world, you don't just get invited to a party. You have to earn the right to be invited in the first place. Picture New York City in the 1880s. Fifth Avenue is lined with mansions that look like they were airlifted in from the Loire Valley, turrets, marble columns, wrought iron gates, the whole production. Inside those mansions live a small number of families who consider themselves, quite literally, society. Not in the vague sense we use the word today, but in a very specific, closed, catalogued sense. There is an actual understanding, some say an actual number, of exactly how many people count as truly important in New York. The commonly cited figure is 400, supposedly because that's how many people could comfortably fit in Mrs. Astore's ballroom. Whether that number was ever gospel truth or just a convenient legend hardly matters. What matters is that everyone acted as though the line existed and spent enormous energy trying to stay on the correct side of it. To even be considered for a dinner invitation, you first had to exist socially. And existing socially meant playing an elaborate, almost bureaucratic game involving small rectangles of paper. The calling card was the entry ticket to this whole system. It was a simple card, printed with your name in a plain, tasteful typeface, nothing showy, because showiness was itself a red flag. Anything that looked like you were trying too hard immediately marked you as new money, and new money was, socially speaking, a little bit contagious and a little bit shameful, at least until it had aged properly, like wine or cheese. You carried a stack of these cards with you, tucked into a small case, and you distributed them according to a set of unspoken rules so intricate they'd make a modern tax code look like a limerick. When you paid a call on someone's household, you often didn't even expect to be let inside. Frequently, the entire transaction consisted of handing your card to a servant at the door and then leaving again. That was it. That was the whole visit. You had made your presence known. Whether anything came of it was out of your hands. Timing mattered enormously. Society ladies kept what were called at-home days, specific afternoons when they were prepared to receive visitors. Arrive on the correct day, and you might be shown into the drawing room for a quarter hour of stilted conversation about the weather. Arrive on the wrong day, and a servant would appear, inform you the lady was not receiving, and you'd be sent back down the front steps, quietly humiliated, wondering what you'd done to offend a woman you hadn't even met yet. And then there was the folding. Yes, the folding. A corner of your calling card, bent just so, carried an entire vocabulary of meaning. One fold might indicate you had delivered the card in person rather than sending it with a servant. Another fold offered congratulations. Another expressed condolences. Nobody explained this system to newcomers. You were simply expected to already know it, the way you're expected to know not to answer a work email at 2 a.m. An unwritten rule that everyone somehow absorbed except, apparently, you. If you cleared all of that, the cards, the folds, the correct days, the correct hours, you might eventually receive something extraordinary, an actual written invitation to an actual formal dinner. This was the top of the pyramid. It would arrive on heavy, fine paper, worded in the formal third person, something to the effect of Mrs. Vanderbilt requests the pleasure of your company. And you did not reply with a casual scrawled, sounds great, see you then. You were expected to respond in the same formal third-person voice promptly, and in your very best handwriting, as though you were answering a summons from royalty, which, in the strange internal logic of Gilded Age New York, you sort of were. Getting your name onto that guest list meant someone, usually a woman, usually one with enormous unspoken authority, had looked at your name, weighed it against everyone else's, and decided you were worth the risk of including. Your presence at the table was, in a very real sense, an endorsement. And here's the uncomfortable truth for our imaginary guest tonight. Even if you cleared every one of these invisible hurdles, you haven't tasted a single bite of food yet, and you're already exhausted. You've navigated a maze built entirely out of stationary and unspoken timing rules, and you did it without a map, because nobody was ever handing out maps. You were supposed to already know the way. Congratulations, you've been invited to dinner. The truly difficult part hasn't even started yet. Part 2. GTTING dressed for battle. So, somehow, against considerable odds, you have received your invitation. You have replied in the correct formal third person, on the correct paper within the correct number of days. Now comes a task that sounds simple and is, in fact, one of the most physically demanding parts of the entire evening: getting dressed. Understand something important right away. Gilded Age formal wear was not clothing in any sense you'd recognize from your own closet. It was closer to architecture. It was closer to upholstery. It was a structure built around a human body, engineered not for comfort or movement but for the display of wealth, status, and the ability to suffer elegantly for hours at a stretch. You did not dress to feel good. You dressed to prove that feeling good was beneath your concern. Let's start with the gentlemen, because their ordeal, while still considerable, was mercifully simpler than what awaited the ladies. The uniform of the evening was white tie, and it left almost no room for personal expression. A black tailcoat, black trousers with a sharp crease, a white waistcoat cut close and unforgiving, a white bow tie that you almost certainly could not tie yourself, no matter how many times you'd watched someone else do it, which meant you needed a valet, or at the very least a patient friend with nimble fingers. And beneath it all, a shirt front so heavily starched with a bosom, the term used for the stiff panel of a formal shirt, that it could, quite literally, stand upright on its own if you set it down on a chair. Then there was the collar, and if there was a single villain in the gentleman's wardrobe, it was this: a tall, rigid band of starched linen, wrapped around the throat and fastened tight enough to gently saw at the skin with every turn of the head. The collar forced your chin up and slightly back into a posture that, whether you intended it or not, radiated a kind of permanent, mild disdain. You couldn't slouch even if you wanted to. You couldn't glance down at your plate without feeling the fabric bite into your neck. You couldn't turn your head quickly to catch something someone said across the table. You had to rotate your entire upper body instead, like a very well-dressed lighthouse. Imagine, for a moment, spending 3 or 4 hours at a dinner table in a collar that actively resists your ability to nod, chew, laugh, or breathe deeply. Now imagine doing that while also being expected to appear utterly relaxed and unbothered. That was the assignment. Gentlemen essentially became decorative pillars for the evening, upright, immobile, silently uncomfortable, and expected to look as though none of it required any effort whatsoever. Now, the ladies. If the gentleman's preparation was a chore, the lady's preparation was a full logistical campaign, closer to outfitting a soldier than dressing for a party. It began with the corset. A maid, because you did not, under any circumstances, attempt this alone, would lace the corset from behind, pulling the strings tight with the same grim, methodical determination you might apply to starting a stubborn lawnmower engine on a cold morning. Pull, adjust, pull again. The goal was to cinch the waist down to a fashionably small circumference, one that, by modern medical standards, would raise more than a few eyebrows. This wasn't a garment you wore. It was a garment that reshaped you, temporarily, into the silhouette the era demanded. Once the corset was secured, the layering began in earnest. Petticoats went on first, sometimes several of them, stacked to create the correct volume and shape beneath the skirt. Then came the gown itself. A heavy, elaborate construction of silk, satin, boning, and often an extensive train that trailed several feet behind you like an expensive tail you were now personally responsible for managing without tripping over it, stepping on it, or letting anyone else step on it either. On top of the gown came the accessories, and accessories barely captures the sheer accumulated weight involved. Long gloves, often reaching past the elbow. Necklaces, bracelets, earrings, real gemstones in the finest households, chosen as much for their ability to signal wealth as for their beauty. A hairstyle piled high, elaborately curled and pinned into what can only be described as total, unyielding submission, sometimes taking well over an hour on its own. By the time a lady was fully dressed for a formal dinner, she weighed noticeably more than she had that morning, was breathing shallower than she had that morning, and had spent the better part of an afternoon in the process. Which is, when you sit with that fact for a moment, genuinely more preparation time than a lot of modern brides spend getting ready for their own weddings. None of this could be accomplished solo. A gentleman required a valet to manage his collar, his tie, his cufflinks, and the general architecture of his outfit. A lady required a maid, sometimes more than one, dedicating hours to lacing, layering, pinning, and arranging. Getting dressed was not a private act. It was a small production with a supporting cast, and everyone involved understood that the final result needed to look effortless, even though effort was the only thing that had gone into it for the past several hours. And here's the part worth sitting with for a moment. None of this discomfort was accidental, and none of it was considered unfortunate. It was the entire point. A restrictive, elaborate, physically demanding outfit announced, without a single word being spoken, that you did not perform manual labor, that you had servants whose entire job was to prepare you for public appearances, and that you were capable of sitting rigidly upright through a 3-hour meal without a single audible complaint. Comfort in this context would have ruined the whole performance. If your clothing looked easy to wear, it implied your life was easy to live, and easy was not a compliment in Gilded Age high society. Difficulty, worn beautifully, was the actual flex. So here you are, the imaginary guest of tonight's story, laced, starched, pinned, and buttoned into a state of elegant paralysis. You haven't eaten anything yet, which should concern you, because in a few hours you'll be expected to make your way through somewhere between 15 and 20 separate courses while wearing this exact outfit. You take a breath. It's a shallow one, it's the only kind currently available to you. You step toward the waiting carriage, dressed to the absolute height of fashion, and quietly, privately, you begin to wonder whether you're going to survive the night in one piece. You are about to find out that getting dressed was, in hindsight, one of the easier parts of the evening. Continuing with more detail on the social meaning of clothing before moving to arrival, since you asked for a long, richly detailed script. Let's pause here and dig a little deeper into why clothing carried this much weight in Gilded Age society, because understanding it makes the rest of the evening make a lot more sense. America in the 1880s was a country going through an identity crisis about wealth. Fortunes were being made faster than anyone quite knew how to handle, from railroads stretching across the continent, from steel mills, from oil fields, from banking empires that seemed to double in size every few years. This new money needed a way to prove itself, to distinguish itself from ordinary wealth, and eventually from itself, separating new money from old money, the recently rich from the multi-generationally rich. Clothing became one of the primary battlegrounds for this competition. A gown wasn't simply a gown. It was a coded message about where you stood. The quality of the fabric, the origin of the lace, the size and clarity of the gemstones, even the cut of the tailcoat, all of it was read, silently and instantly, by every other guest in the room. People who had grown up in this world could glance at your outfit for perhaps 2 seconds and form a fairly accurate assessment of your family's financial standing, how long that money had existed, and whether your dressmaker was considered fashionable or hopelessly behind the times. This is part of why new money families invested so heavily and so anxiously in getting every detail exactly right. A slightly wrong shade, an outdated silhouette, jewelry that looked too large or too showy. Any of these could brand you instantly as someone still learning the rules, someone whose wealth hadn't yet been properly aged into acceptability. The old families, the ones who'd held their fortunes for generations, could afford to underplay their appearance slightly, because their status was already secure. It was the newly wealthy who had the most to prove, and who therefore suffered the most anxiety over every seam and stitch. Think about what this meant for our unfortunate guest tonight, the one we're following through this entire ordeal. Every choice made hours before the party, which gown, which gloves, which shade of silk, was already shaping how the evening's judgments would play out, long before a single word had been spoken or a single fork had been lifted. The evaluation didn't start at the front door. It started the moment you stepped out of your home, and there was a cruel asymmetry built into all of this. The people born into this world had closets, dressmakers, and family jewelry passed down through generations, all curated over decades to project exactly the right note of confident, understated wealth. A newcomer had to somehow reconstruct that entire aesthetic instinct from scratch, usually by hearing the same dressmakers and buying similarly extravagant jewelry, and often overshooting the mark in the process. Buying gowns slightly too elaborate, jewelry slightly too large, all in an anxious attempt to prove they belonged. And that overshooting was itself exactly the kind of tell that experienced society eyes were trained to spot instantly. So by the time our guest tonight climbs into the waiting carriage, laced and pinned and dressed in borrowed finery, an entire silent verdict may already be forming among the guests who will later glance at that gown or that tailcoat and draw their own quiet conclusions. The dinner party hasn't started. The judging already has. Part 3. Arriving. At the mansion, the carriage rocks gently over cobblestones, and through the window you begin to see them, the mansions of Fifth Avenue rising up out of the New York darkness like something imported wholesale from a different country and a different century. These are not houses in any sense you'd recognize. They are private palaces, stacked with imported marble, dressed in carved stone facades, crowned with turrets that would look perfectly at home on a French chateau. Every single detail has been chosen and paid for specifically to make you feel small the moment you lay eyes on it, and it is working exactly as intended. Carriages line the street ahead, moving in a slow, dignified traffic jam of the ultra-wealthy, each one waiting its turn to deposit its glittering passengers at the entrance. This is, in effect, an aristocratic parking lot, and you sit inside your own carriage watching the ones ahead of you unload, trying to memorize how the guests before you step down, how they hold themselves, how they seem to glide effortlessly from carriage door to mansion entrance without a single wasted motion. And here is the first trap of the evening, one that has nothing to do with forks or wine glasses: timing your arrival correctly. Show up too early, and you look desperate, like someone who has been circling the block for the last 20 minutes just to avoid being fashionably late, which, incidentally, is exactly what you have been doing. Show up too late, and you have committed a genuine social offense, disrupting the hostess's careful seating plans, delaying the meal for everyone else, and marking yourself as someone who cannot be trusted to manage their own schedule. The acceptable window for arrival is narrow enough to make hitting it feel like threading a needle while blindfolded. Finally, your carriage reaches the entrance. A footman in white gloves steps forward and opens the door for you, offering a steady hand as you descend. Your feet touch down not on the street itself, but on a strip of carpet that has been laid across the sidewalk, specifically, so that the shoes of arriving guests never once make contact with common pavement. Already, before you've spoken a single word to anyone, you are being watched by the footman, by the other guests filing in behind you, and quite possibly by faces at the upper windows of the mansion, curious about who has just arrived. Let's talk for a moment about the sheer scale of these homes, because it's worth understanding just how deliberately intimidating they were designed to be. Families with names like Vanderbilt and Astor didn't simply build large houses. They built architectural statements, competing with one another to see who could import the most marble, commission the most elaborate staircases, hang the largest chandeliers, and generally construct something that looked less like a private residence and more like a museum that occasionally happened to serve dinner. Every design choice, from the height of the ceilings to the placement of the windows, existed to communicate one single unmistakable message. We have more money than you can reasonably imagine, and you are about to spend an entire evening inside a physical demonstration of that fact. Arriving on foot, incidentally, was simply not done. A guest of any real standing arrived by carriage, and this created its own peculiar bottleneck, with dozens of carriages queuing patiently along the street, each waiting its turn to glide up to the entrance and release its passengers in a small, carefully choreographed moment of arrival. And once you reach the entrance itself, often sheltered beneath a covered porch built specifically so the wealthy never had to experience something as common as rain or wind while entering a building, a servant appeared instantly at your side, handling you down from the carriage with the exaggerated care you might expect if you were made of very expensive, very breakable glass. The timing trap we mentioned earlier deserves a bit more attention because it reveals something important about how this entire society operated. A formal dinner invitation specified a particular hour, and every experienced guest understood without being told that there existed an unspoken acceptable window around that hour. Arrive a little after the stated time, but not too much after. Arrive exactly on the dot, and you risk looking overly eager, like someone with nothing better to do than watch the clock. Arrive significantly early, and you might catch the household still finishing preparations, an intrusion nobody wanted. Arrive late, and you had committed a genuine transgression, one that could ripple outward and affect the entire evening's schedule, since a formal dinner often couldn't properly begin until every invited guest had arrived and settled into the drawing room. The goal, always, was to appear as though you had drifted in at precisely the correct moment through nothing more than natural instinct, as though timing your grand entrance perfectly was simply something that happened to you effortlessly, rather than something you had spent the entire carriage ride anxiously calculating. Once inside the entrance, the ritual of shedding your outerwear began immediately. Servants materialized from what seemed like nowhere to take your coat, your hat, your cloak, whisking them away to a cloakroom with quiet, practiced efficiency. Ladies were sometimes shown to a separate room where they could check their appearance in a mirror and repair any small damage the carriage ride might have inflicted on an elaborately arranged hairstyle. Gentlemen surrendered their coats, straightened their already painfully straight collars, and prepared themselves mentally for whatever came next. And make no mistake, You were being evaluated from the very first second the footman opened your carriage door. The way you stepped down, the steadiness or lack of steadiness in your legs after a long carriage ride in restrictive clothing, the confidence or the poorly concealed panic visible in your posture and your expression. All of it was noted, quietly and instantly, by the small army of household staff positioned throughout the entrance, and potentially by any guests who happened to glance out a window at just the right moment to catch your arrival. In this particular world, first impressions were not formed during the initial handshake or the first exchanged pleasantry. They were formed before you had said a single word to anyone at all, simply by how you existed, physically, for those first few seconds after stepping out of the carriage. So here you stand, correctly timed, correctly dressed, correctly delivered to the correct mansion by the correct means of transportation. You have surrendered your coat to the correct servant without incident. Everything, so far, has gone exactly according to plan. And yet, as you begin walking toward the distant sound of murmured conversation and the gentle clink of crystal glasses, a small, persistent feeling settles somewhere in your chest. The unmistakable sense that the evening has not yet actually begun to test you. That feeling, unfortunately, is entirely correct. The front hall and the announcement ahead of you, past a forest of marble columns and beneath a staircase wide enough to comfortably land a small aircraft, stands the butler. And make no mistake about his importance. In a household of this size, the butler is not simply a servant who opens doors. He is, in every practical sense, the general of an entire domestic army, a figure of considerable dignity who oversees the household staff with something approaching military precision. He knows every prominent family in the city. He knows every rivalry, every scandal, every reputation, carefully filed away behind an expression of perfect neutrality. You hand him your invitation. You state your name, and he repeats it loudly, clearly, in a tone that carries effortlessly across the entire gathered room ahead of you, making any hope of a quiet, unnoticed entrance completely impossible. If you mumble your own name, if you fidget while waiting for the announcement, if your name simply happens to be unfamiliar, or difficult to pronounce, or lacking the particular ring of old established wealth, every head in that room turns, and every eyebrow rises by some small, almost imperceptible fraction. This is the 1880s equivalent of walking into an important meeting, and only then realizing your microphone has been unmuted for the last 5 minutes. There is no taking it back now. The entrance hall itself has been built with exactly this moment in mind. Soaring ceilings stretch upward into shadow. Polished floors reflect the candlelight back at you. Oil paintings of stern, long-deceased ancestors gaze down from the walls with expressions that seem to have been specifically calibrated for judging strangers. Your own footsteps echo audibly as you walk, and the air itself seems to smell of hothouse flowers, beeswax polish, and something less definable that can only be described as the specific scent of enormous, well-maintained wealth. Then comes the announcement itself, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, because on paper it sounds like such a small formality, simply saying someone's name out loud as they enter a room. In practice, it was anything but small. It meant your arrival became a genuinely public event. A room full of some of the wealthiest and most socially influential people in the entire city turned, as one, to look directly at you the instant your name rang out across the marble hall. There was no possibility of slipping in quietly, no chance to hover unnoticed near a convenient potted plant until you felt sufficiently comfortable to engage. You were announced, whether you wanted to be or not, and in that moment, your name itself carried a kind of social weight that's genuinely difficult to translate into modern terms. Your name was, in a very real sense, your resume, read aloud to a room full of people ready to instantly evaluate its contents. The old, established families recognized one another's names instantly and reacted accordingly, warm smiles, easy nods of recognition, small gestures of belonging. An unfamiliar name, on the other hand, prompted an entirely different reaction, a wave of silent, polite curiosity rippling through the room. Who are they? Where did their money actually come from? How, precisely, did they manage to secure an invitation to this particular gathering? These questions were never spoken aloud, but you could feel them, hanging in the air, directed squarely at you. This is also precisely why composure mattered so enormously in this single moment. You could not visibly flinch when your own name boomed unexpectedly loud across a marble entrance hall full of strangers. You were expected to glide into the room smoothly and calmly, as though being announced this way was simply the ordinary, unremarkable condition of your everyday life. Any visible hesitation, any flustered, searching glance around the room, hunting desperately for a single familiar or friendly face, all of it would be noticed, and all of it would be quietly remembered. The truly polished, thoroughly trained guest entered as though the entire elaborate spectacle of the announcement was faintly beneath their notice, a minor formality, barely worth acknowledging. So you take the deepest breath your corset or your unforgiving collar will actually permit, which is not, admittedly, a very deep breath at all, and you step forward into the light. The butler draws himself up to his full, considerable height. Your name fills the room, echoing off marble and gilt in expensive silence. Dozens of eyes swing toward you simultaneously, cool, appraising, and entirely unhurried, as though they have all the time in the world to form their judgment of you, because, of course, they do. You have officially been delivered, gift-wrapped, clearly labeled, and presented directly into the center of the lion's den. And every single lion in that room has attended a dinner exactly like this one, more times than they could possibly count. Part 4. The drawing room. And meeting the hostess, you are funneled, gently but unmistakably, into the drawing room, where the rest of the arrived guests are gathered before dinner, standing in small clusters, quietly sizing one another up over glasses that never seem to require refilling. There is no real sitting here, not comfortably anyway, and there is absolutely no relaxing. This is the mingling phase of the evening, a delicate, choreographed dance of small talk in which you're expected to appear effortlessly charming while privately terrified out of your mind. Nobody hands you a stiff drink to take the edge off, because that would be far too merciful for an evening built entirely on quiet tension. Understand why this phase exists at all. Guests were expected to arrive ahead of the meal itself, gathering together in one room so that everyone could greet the hosts, exchange the necessary pleasantries, and be properly present the moment dinner was formally announced. In practice, this created an unusual kind of holding pattern, a stretch of time in which an extraordinary number of extraordinarily wealthy people stood around a beautifully decorated room, making pleasant, meaningless noises at one another simply to pass the time until the actual meal began. It is, in essence, the original awkward pre-meeting mingle, except that everyone around you has been armed since childhood with generations of inherited etiquette, and you have been armed with nothing but hope and an uncomfortably tight collar. The room itself functions as its own quiet statement of wealth. Drawing rooms in these mansions were stuffed, deliberately and lavishly, with every available signal of taste and spending power. Silk wallpaper, gilded mirrors reflecting candlelight back and forth across the room, imported furniture so delicate-looking that you find yourself afraid to actually sit on any of it, paintings chosen not necessarily because anyone particularly enjoyed looking at them, but because they signaled culture, refinement, and a certain European sophistication. You are meant to admire all of this without ever appearing to gawk, because gawking would reveal, instantly and embarrassingly, that you are not accustomed to being surrounded by this kind of casual luxury, and being visibly unaccustomed to wealth was, in this world, the great unspoken shame of the entire age. Introductions themselves were a minefield all their own. You did not simply walk up to a stranger and introduce yourself directly, the way you might at a casual gathering today. That kind of self-introduction was considered forward, even faintly vulgar. Instead, a proper introduction had to be performed by a third party, ideally the hostess herself, or some mutual acquaintance already known to both parties, who would present you to others according to a careful, almost mathematical set of rules governing rank, age, and gender. Until you had been formally introduced to someone by an appropriate third party, that person remained, technically, a complete stranger, and speaking to a stranger without a proper introduction was itself a small, quiet social trespass. So you hovered, waiting patiently to be handed around the room like a particularly delicate plate of hors d'oeuvres, unable to simply approach anyone who caught your eye. And then, of course, there was the conversation itself, which had to remain pleasant, light, and entirely, deliberately weightless. You discussed the recent opera performance. You commented on the unusually mild weather. You mentioned someone's upcoming voyage to Europe, or perhaps some entirely harmless piece of gossip about a person who happened not to be present in the room. What you absolutely did not do, under any circumstances, was say anything genuinely interesting, remotely controversial, or unusually memorable. Because in this particular world, appearing safe was worth infinitely more than appearing clever. The unspoken goal of the entire mingling phase was to leave everyone around you with a vague, pleasant impression that you were agreeable and well-bred, while leaving no impression sharp enough or specific enough to ever be used against you later, in whatever quiet conversations happened once you'd left the room. Meanwhile, beneath all the smiling and the empty pleasantries, everyone present was quietly taking careful inventory of everyone else. They noticed your clothing, your jewelry, the ease or visible unease in your manner. They noted precisely who you spoke to, and just as importantly, who bothered to come speak with you. A newcomer left standing alone for too long in a crowded room was a newcomer that nobody particularly wanted to associate with, and that uncomfortable fact was visible to the entire gathering, whether anyone acknowledged it aloud or not. Social survival, in these tense opening minutes, was largely a matter of always appearing to belong exactly where you were standing, even while every nerve in your body screamed quietly that you did not. So you stand there, a glass of something you're not entirely sure you should be drinking held carefully in one gloved hand, making pleasant, weightless remarks about the weather to a woman who may, for all you know, be quietly deciding your entire social worth in real time. Your collar tightens almost imperceptibly. Your smile begins ever so slightly to ache at the corners, and just as you start to believe, against all evidence, that you might actually survive this particular phase of the evening intact, a servant appears silently in the doorway. The murmur of conversation around you begins to fade, and you realize with a small lurch somewhere in your stomach that the real test, the actual dinner itself, is finally about to begin. Meeting the hostess, but first, you must greet the hostess, and quietly, without any exaggeration at all, she is the single most powerful person you will meet all evening. In Gilded Age society, the lady of the house functioned as something between a general, a gatekeeper, and a judge, all wrapped together in one glittering, perfectly composed package. Think of a woman like the real-life Carolina Store, a figure whose personal approval could elevate an entire family into the highest circles of New York society, and whose quiet disapproval could just as easily erase that same family from consideration entirely, sometimes without a single word of explanation ever being offered. You approach her carefully. You offer a small, respectful bow or a careful, practiced curtsy. You say something pleasant, warm, and, ideally, instantly forgettable, because being memorable in the wrong way is far more dangerous in this room than simply being a little dull. She smiles back at you, and here's the uncomfortable truth. You genuinely cannot tell from that smile alone whether it represents real warmth or merely the polite, practiced opening notes of your eventual social downfall. Neither, for what it's worth, can anyone else standing nearby watching the exchange. That uncertainty is, in fact, rather the entire point of how she operates. To understand just how much power this one woman held, you have to understand how high society actually functioned as a system. It was not run by any government body, nor by men sitting in formal offices somewhere downtown. It was run quietly, privately, and often quite ruthlessly, by a small, tightly knit circle of elite women who collectively decided who belonged and who did not. These women controlled the guest lists. They controlled the introductions. They controlled which invitations went out and which quietly never arrived at all, and in doing so, they controlled the social fate of entire families, sometimes for a generation or more. A husband might be the one who actually earned the fortune, out on the trading floor or in the boardroom, but it was frequently his wife, or another woman entirely, who ultimately decided whether that fortune bought the family an actual seat at society's table. The real Caroline Astor stood as the towering example of this kind of quiet authority, reigning as something like the queen of New York society for years, working alongside a professional social arbiter named Ward McAllister, who helped formalize and enforce the increasingly elaborate rules of the entire system. She became closely associated with that famous idea of the 400, supposedly the exact number of people who genuinely mattered in New York society, a figure often explained by how many guests could comfortably fit inside her ballroom for a proper party. Whether that number was ever truly precise hardly matters for our purposes tonight. What matters is the underlying principle that a single woman, supported by her small circle of allies, could effectively draw an invisible line around the entirety of society and then decide, guest by guest, family by family, exactly which side of that line you belonged on. This is precisely why greeting the hostess correctly carried so much unspoken weight. Your approach had to strike an extremely careful balance, respectful but never groveling, confident but never overly familiar, as though you'd known her for years when you clearly hadn't. You offered the appropriate physical gesture, whether a slight bow or a graceful curtsy. You spoke briefly and warmly without allowing yourself to linger too long in front of her. You thanked her sincerely for the invitation, perhaps offered a small, genuine compliment about her home or her decorating. And then you moved along, because monopolizing the hostess's attention for too long was considered both rude and quietly revealing. An unmistakable mark of someone who simply did not understand where they stood in the room's social hierarchy. The particular danger of this exchange was that her graciousness gave you almost nothing useful to actually read or interpret. A truly skilled hostess remained unfailingly polite to absolutely everyone in the room, which meant her warm smile toward you might signal genuine approval in future invitations. Or it might be the exact same practiced, professional smile she offered to guests she privately intended never to invite back again. You could walk away from that brief exchange feeling triumphant and encouraged, and still, unknowingly, have failed some invisible test you didn't even realize you were taking. That persistent uncertainty was, in its own way, a deliberate form of social control, one that kept every guest slightly anxious and endlessly eager to please throughout the remainder of the evening. And her quiet judgment of you did not end the moment you walked away from that first greeting. She continued watching, throughout the rest of the night, how you conducted yourself at every subsequent stage of the evening, how you treated the household servants, how you handled the seemingly endless parade of courses, whether you appeared to genuinely know the countless unwritten rules or were simply doing a passable job of faking your way through them. All of it fed quietly into a final, private verdict that would ultimately determine whether your name appeared on her guest lists for future gatherings, or slowly, silently vanished from them altogether. So you offer your small, careful bow. You deliver your forgettable little pleasantry about her lovely home. You receive, in return, that maddeningly unreadable smile. And in that brief exchange, you have just greeted a woman who, in this particular world, wields considerably more genuine social power than most of the men currently standing in this very room will ever dream of holding themselves. You drift away as gracefully as your restrictive clothing will physically allow, quietly resolving to spend the rest of the evening being absolutely flawless in every possible way. You will not, as it happens, manage that. Nobody entirely does. But you don't know that yet. Part 5. The The pairing and the procession just when you think you might be able to quietly hide in a corner for a few minutes and catch your breath. The hostess does something that fills you with a fresh wave of quiet dread. She pairs you off. In Gilded Age dining, you did not get to choose your own dinner companion, nor did you get any say in who you'd be talking to for the next several hours. Instead, you were assigned a partner based on an invisible ranking system so intricate and so precisely calibrated that it may as well have been advanced physics. Rank, title, family wealth, marital status, age, and general social standing were all weighed carefully in advance, and the hostess arranged the resulting pairings with the calm, calculating precision of a chess master settling an old score. You might find yourself paired with a visiting duchess passing through the city. You might be handed off to a railroad baron who has spent the last 3 decades building an empire out of steel and timber. Or you might find yourself paired with someone so far above your own social station that simply attempting to hold a conversation with them feels, in some vague and undefined way, faintly illegal. And whoever it turns out to be, you are now committed to their company for the next several hours, for better or for considerably worse. This pairing process was never random, and it was never treated casually by the hostess responsible for it. Deciding exactly who would escort whom into dinner, and who would ultimately sit beside whom at the table, was widely considered one of a hostess's most important and most genuinely agonized over responsibilities, sometimes planned out days in advance with the help of actual diagrams and carefully drawn seating charts. She had to balance rank carefully against rank, avoid seating known rivals or enemies anywhere near one another, deliberately separate married couples who were traditionally never paired together for the meal itself, and somehow make the entire arrangement flow smoothly according to the accepted rules of social precedence. It was seating arranged as pure strategy, and a single careless mistake in the process could genuinely offend a powerful guest for years to come, souring relationships that had taken decades to build. In the most formal households, a gentleman would be quietly informed, often by way of a small handwritten card, exactly which lady he had been assigned to escort into dinner. He was then expected to seek her out personally among the crowded drawing room, offer her his arm with appropriate confidence, and become her designated companion and conversational partner for the length of the entire meal. A meal that, as you'll soon discover, could easily stretch past 3 hours. If you happen to be that gentleman tonight, this meant approaching a complete stranger with an outward appearance of total composure, all while quietly preparing yourself to entertain her attentively through course after course after course. No pressure whatsoever. The underlying logic behind these pairings followed rank with something close to mathematical precision. The single most important gentleman present at the gathering would escort the single most important lady, and the arrangement continued down the social ladder from there in careful, descending order. This meant that your own assigned partner effectively functioned as a kind of public statement about exactly where the hostess believed you belonged in the overall hierarchy of the evening. Being paired with someone of considerable social standing suggested, to the entire room, that you mattered. Being paired instead with the least significant guest in attendance, quietly relegated to what amounted to the social equivalent of the cheap seats, told you, and everyone else paying attention, precisely how you were currently regarded, and everyone at that table, without exception, understood exactly how to read this particular kind of ranking at a single glance. Then there was the sheer, grinding social endurance the pairing demanded of you. This was not a person you could politely greet for 30 seconds and then quietly abandon in favor of more interesting company. This was your partner, your responsibility, your conversational obligation for the length of the entire meal, or at least until a particular ritual, one we'll get to shortly, finally released you from the arrangement. If your assigned partner turned out to be genuinely delightful, warm, funny, engaging, then congratulations. You had won something close to a small lottery. If, on the other hand, they turned out to be dull, pompous, or determined to describe the intricacies of their latest business venture in truly exhausting detail. You were simply trapped, smiling politely, nodding at appropriate intervals, slowly aging in real time while silently calculating how many courses remained before some kind of merciful release. And you had to make the arrangement work regardless of your private feelings on the matter, because visible boredom, or any hint of coldness directed toward your assigned dinner partner, was considered a genuine and noticeable breach of manners. You were expected to remain attentive, charming, and fully engaged throughout, drawing your partner out in conversation, listening with what had to at least appear to be genuine fascination, and never once allowing your eyes to drift longingly toward the exit. In a very real sense, your partner's enjoyment of the evening was, at least in theory, considered more important than your own personal comfort. Their satisfaction was, quite literally, your job for the night. So the small card is handed to you, or perhaps handed to your assigned escort, and the name written on it is revealed. You cross the crowded drawing room to formally introduce yourself to the stranger who will now occupy the next several hours of your evening, for better or for worse. Perhaps you've drawn a witty, genuinely warm companion who somehow makes the entire ordeal feel almost bearable. Or perhaps you've drawn someone who is already visibly inhaling in preparation to begin a lengthy monologue about railway freight tariffs. Either way, you offer your arm, fix a pleasant smile carefully into place, and accept your fate. Choice, it turns out, was never actually part of the arrangement. The procession into dinner now comes the procession. When dinner is finally, formally announced, you do not simply wander casually toward the dining room the way a normal, hungry human being might. Instead, the entire assembled party lines up and proceeds into the dining room in a strict, carefully observed order of precedence, moving from the most socially important guest down to the very least important, which means that you, almost certainly, will find yourself somewhere near the back of this slow-moving line, shuffling along like the caboose of an extremely expensive, extremely well-dressed train. You offer your assigned partner your arm. You match their unhurried, deliberate pace. And together, you walk in slow, ceremonial near silence toward a meal you are increasingly convinced you are not remotely qualified to eat. Everyone else in this procession seems to know exactly where they belong in the line without needing to check, and the simple fact that you had to glance around, even briefly, to locate your own position has already somehow been noticed. Of course it has. It's worth understanding that this procession was never mere decoration or empty ceremony. It functioned as a genuine, public ranking of every single person in the room, performed slowly, deliberately, and in full view of everyone present. The specific order in which people entered the dining room announced, quite plainly, their exact standing within the evening's social hierarchy, and every guest present understood precisely how to read that unspoken message. Walking into dinner amounted, in effect, to a live, moving leaderboard of social importance, and you were a participant in that leaderboard whether you particularly wanted to be or not. The host typically led the procession, and here's a small detail that tends to surprise people encountering it for the first time. He did not escort his own wife into dinner. Tradition instead dictated that the host offer his arm to the most distinguished lady in attendance, often the guest of honor for the evening, while the hostess herself was escorted in by the single most important gentleman present, frequently entering the dining room last rather than first. Married couples, as a general rule, were split apart entirely for the duration of the meal. So the whole elaborate affair began, quite deliberately, by politely separating husbands from wives and rearranging the entire party according to individual rank, which is, when you actually stop to consider it, a genuinely strange way to begin what is ostensibly a shared family meal. You and your own assigned partner took your place within this careful sequence according to your combined social rank as a pair. If the two of you carried real social weight, you moved comfortably toward the front of the line. If you did not, you drifted, inevitably, toward the rear, following along behind the backs of people considerably grander than yourselves, moving down a hallway lined with more visible wealth than most people would encounter in an entire lifetime. The pace itself remained slow and deliberately dignified throughout. There was no rushing, no eager scurrying toward the enticing smell of food drifting from the dining room ahead, because visible enthusiasm of that kind was considered appropriate only for people who were not accustomed to being fed quite this well, quite this often. The dining room itself, as you finally approach it, reveals itself to be its own genuine spectacle, and the slow, ceremonial pace of the procession gives you ample time to take it all in and feel appropriately intimidated by what you're seeing. An enormous table gleams beneath elaborate chandeliers and the soft flicker of countless candles. Flowers and polished silver stretch away down its considerable length, seemingly without end. Household servants stand perfectly still and ready along the walls, positioned like well-dressed statues waiting patiently for their cue. Every visible element has been carefully arranged to be seen and admired, and your own slow, ceremonial approach ensures that you take in absolutely all of it, and that the room, in turn, quietly takes in you. There is also, it turns out, a subtle art to the walk itself. You have to move precisely at your partner's chosen pace, neither dragging them impatiently along nor lagging awkwardly behind, offering your arm at exactly the correct height, making light, appropriately murmured conversation if the moment seems to call for it, and generally behaving as though gliding gracefully into dinner as part of an elaborately ranked procession is simply the most natural, unremarkable thing in the entire world. Any visible stumble, any obvious confusion about which direction to walk, any awkwardness at all with your assigned partner, all of it plays out in full view of the considerable number of guests filing along steadily behind you. So you shuffle forward, arm politely extended, your assigned partner at your side, following a slow, glittering river of silk and starch steadily toward the dining room ahead. You find yourself positioned somewhere near the back of the procession, which tells absolutely everyone present exactly how the hostess has chosen to rank you this particular evening, and there is, at this point, genuinely nothing left to be done about it. You finally reach the doorway. Candlelight glitters across what looks like an entire ocean of polished silverware stretching out ahead of you. And the real gauntlet of the evening, the one built entirely from forks, wine glasses, and an apparently endless list of unspoken rules, is finally, unavoidably, about to begin. Part 6. Finding your seat, you reach the table at last, and now you face a task that has been cleverly disguised as a simple courtesy: finding your assigned seat. Each place at this enormous table is marked with a small card bearing a name written in elegant, practiced script, and yours is out there somewhere, lost in a vast landscape of fine china and gleaming crystal, almost certainly nowhere near anyone you'd actually choose to sit beside given the option. Seating in the Gilded Age was, in every meaningful sense, pure warfare conducted through the polite medium of place cards. Being seated near the host signaled to the entire room that you genuinely mattered. Being seated at the far end of the table, closer to the drafty doorway and surrounded by the least significant guests present, communicated exactly what the hostess privately thought of you, without her ever needing to say a single word aloud. You locate your card. You settle into your seat. And despite every effort not to, you find yourself quietly calculating your own social value based on how many other guests are seated between you and the guest of honor. You do this calculation anyway. Everyone does. The place card system existed fundamentally for one clear reason: control. The hostess had invested real time and genuine mental effort into deciding exactly where every single guest would sit, and she had absolutely no intention of allowing anyone to casually rearrange her careful planning simply by sitting wherever happened to look convenient. Small cards, often beautifully printed or elegantly handwritten by hand, marked each assigned position at the table. You were expected to locate yours quietly, without fuss or visible confusion, and settle into it exactly as instructed. Wandering the length of the table, visibly searching for your name, was not a particularly flattering look. But sitting confidently in the wrong seat was, without question, considerably worse. The overall arrangement itself functioned as a kind of physical map of power, laid out in miniature across the length of the dinner table. The most honored guests sat closest to the host and hostess, with everyone else radiating outward in descending order of importance toward the far ends of the table. This meant your own assigned seat effectively became a kind of public verdict on your standing. Finding yourself seated near the head of the table meant you had been judged worthy of close proximity to the people who mattered most in the room. Finding yourself marooned toward the far end, surrounded by other similarly minor guests, and perhaps an occasional draft slipping in from a nearby doorway, sent a message that was gentle in tone but entirely unmistakable in meaning. You were tolerated. You were not particularly treasured. Guests who attended these kinds of dinners regularly became intimately familiar with reading these seating arrangements, which meant they could tell, almost at a glance, exactly who had recently risen in the hostess's estimation and who had quietly fallen. Someone who had gained favor since the previous gathering might find themselves seated noticeably higher this time around, and the entire table would register the change instantly, even if nobody commented on it directly. Someone who had fallen out of favor might find themselves placed conspicuously lower than before, a soft, entirely silent form of public correction, delivered exclusively through the careful positioning of a small printed name card. It amounted to social scorekeeping, conducted almost entirely in polished, well-mannered silence. There were, on top of all this, the small physical mechanics of actually sitting down, which offered you fresh opportunities to stumble at the very last moment. A gentleman was generally expected to help the lady seated beside him settle properly into her chair before taking his own seat, a gesture that required managing her chair, her lengthy train, and his own rigid, unforgiving formal wear all at the same time, ideally without knocking over so much as a single wine glass in the process. You settled into your own seat carefully, without scraping the chair loudly against the floor, without bumping the table hard enough to rattle the towering, delicate arrangement of glassware in front of you, and without visibly reacting, one way or another, to whoever fate and the hostess had ultimately decided to seat on either side of you. Because those two people, whoever they turned out to be, were now effectively your entire social universe for the remainder of the meal. The person to your immediate left and the person to your immediate right would become, thanks to the strict and specific rules of dinner conversation we'll get to shortly, your complete and total conversational world for the duration of the evening. Finding a genuine friend seated beside you counted as a small personal miracle. Finding instead a stranger, a known rival, or the dreaded monologuing businessman was simply your assignment for the night, and you were expected to make the very best of it while wearing a warm, entirely untroubled expression the entire time. So you locate your small printed card at last. You slide as gracefully as your restrictive clothing allows into your appointed seat. And you perform, almost against your own will, the quiet mental arithmetic of counting exactly how many chairs separate you from the guest of honor at the head of the table. The resulting number is not, admittedly, especially flattering. You smile anyway. You unfold your napkin carefully into your lap, and you prepare to face the glittering arsenal of silver and crystal laid out before you. Your seat has already quietly told the entire room what you're worth tonight. Now, the silverware is about to decide whether you can prove that assessment wrong. The overwhelming table setting lets talk for a moment about the table itself, because it has been very deliberately designed to intimidate you, and it is currently succeeding at that goal without any effort at all. Stretched out in front of you is an entire landscape of gleaming china, polished crystal, carefully folded linen, and enough silverware to reasonably fund a small military campaign. There are plates stacked upon plates, glasses arranged in careful, deliberate formation, small, mysterious utensils whose exact purpose you genuinely cannot begin to guess at. Flowers rise in great fragrant walls down the center of the table. Candles flicker steadily in polished silver holders along its entire length. Somewhere hidden within all of this glittering, overwhelming display is the correct way to proceed through the evening, and nobody has handed you so much as a hint of a map. To everyone else seated around you, this elaborate arrangement is simply another ordinary Tuesday evening. To you, it looks disturbingly like the cockpit of an aircraft you are personally about to fly directly into the side of a mountain. Let's start with the linen, because even the tablecloth carries its own quiet statement of wealth. The finest households dress their tables in spotless white damask, heavy, gleaming fabric pressed to an almost unnerving degree of perfection, often paired with matching napkins folded into elaborate decorative shapes almost too impressive to actually unfold and use. This particular fabric existed purely to demonstrate that the household in question could easily afford genuinely beautiful things, along with an entire staff of servants dedicated to keeping those things immaculately maintained. You are, at this very moment, about to eat your way through somewhere around 20 separate courses directly on top of this fabric, without spilling so much as a single visible drop, which feels considerably less like an ordinary dinner, and rather more like an elaborate dare quietly issued by the furniture itself. Then there's the centerpiece, which in the grandest of these homes amounted to a genuine visual spectacle in its own right. Towering arrangements of imported hothouse flowers, elaborate silver structures holding fruit, sweets, and yet more flowers, candelabra dripping with soft, flickering candlelight, all marching in careful formation down the center of the table in a display clearly meant to overwhelm anyone seated nearby. These centerpiece arrangements could grow so tall and so visually dense that you genuinely could not see the guests seated directly across from you, which was, arguably, something of a small mercy, since it meant at least a few fewer witnesses to your quiet, ongoing struggle throughout the meal. The glassware alone was enough to induce a small private wave of panic. At each individual place setting stood an entire cluster of glasses in different shapes and sizes, one intended for water, and several more waiting for the various wines that would accompany each successive course of the meal. To an untrained eye, the whole arrangement looked rather like a delicate crystal forest that had somehow sprouted directly out of the tablecloth, and you had absolutely no reliable way of knowing, at a glance, which particular glass was destined for which particular drink. Guessing incorrectly wasn't going to be catastrophic entirely on its own, but it represented one more small, quiet opportunity to reveal that you didn't fully understand what you were doing at this table. And presiding over the entire arrangement was the china itself, the plates that would arrive and depart in a steady, continuous rotation throughout the meal. At many formal dinners, a large, purely decorative plate sat waiting at your place setting when you first arrived, functioning essentially as a placeholder that would be swapped out repeatedly as the various courses came and went throughout the evening. Each individual dish arrived with its own specifically appropriate plate, and the entire rotating system was managed by household servants with a choreography so smooth and so practiced that it made your own quiet uncertainty feel even more glaringly, embarrassingly obvious by comparison. You were, in that particular moment, very possibly the only person seated at this entire table who did not already know the steps to this particular dance. The underlying point of all this careful splendor was never simply to hold food, of course. It existed to display wealth, taste, and total command of the situation, all at a scale specifically designed to impress onlookers and, quite deliberately, to slightly unnerve them at the same time. A table set this elaborately announced, without a single word being spoken, that the host possessed the financial means to acquire all of it, the cultural knowledge to arrange it precisely correctly, and the well-trained household staff necessary to maintain and serve it flawlessly, course after course, for hours on end. It amounted to a performance rendered entirely in porcelain and polished silver, and you had been seated right in the middle of that performance, expected to play your own small supporting role without a single visible misstep. So you sit quietly before this dazzling, genuinely bewildering expanse of silver, crystal, and flowers, taking in the towering centerpiece, the crystal forest of glasses, the seemingly endless silverware, and the perfectly pressed white linen stretching out before you. It is, without question, beautiful. It is also, in equal measure, deeply intimidating. And somewhere within this glittering arrangement, you know with growing certainty, are more than a dozen individual forks and spoons that you are about to be expected to use in precisely the correct order, one after another, for the next several hours. You take one more careful, shallow breath, the only kind your restrictive formal wear currently permits, as the very first course of the evening begins making its way toward the table. Part 7. The Silverware Battle. Now let's talk about the silverware itself, because it is, quietly and without exaggeration, the single greatest trap ever devised for an unprepared dinner guest. Laid out carefully around your plate is an entire small battalion of forks, knives, and spoons, sometimes more than a dozen separate pieces in total, each one designed for one very specific course and absolutely nothing else. There is a fork built exclusively for oysters, a fork designed specifically for fish, a fork intended only for the entree, and at least one additional utensil whose exact purpose you will, quite honestly, never fully manage to understand by the end of the evening. The one rule you cling to is easy enough to state, and nearly impossible to actually survive in practice. You work from the outside in, using exactly one utensil per course. Reach for the wrong one at the wrong moment, and while nobody at the table will ever say a single word about it out loud, every experienced diner present will quietly notice and quietly file the mistake away for future reference. It is judgment delivered entirely through cutlery, and you are already somehow losing this particular contest. Let's start with the one genuinely merciful principle buried in this whole system, the outside-in rule, because it's the closest thing you have to an actual lifeline tonight. The utensils are arranged, deliberately, in the exact order you'll need them throughout the meal, with tools meant for the earliest courses placed farthest away from the plate, and those meant for later courses tucked in closer. In theory, this means you could simply reach for whichever utensil sits farthest out each time a new dish arrives, and trust the careful arrangement to guide you safely through the entire sequence. In practice, it means that a single wrong move made early in the meal can throw off your entire internal count for the rest of the evening, leaving you, several courses later, attempting to eat dessert with what is unmistakably an oyster fork. Then there's the sheer, dizzying degree of specialization involved in all of this. This was an era genuinely obsessed with having exactly the correct implement for every conceivable task at the table, and silver manufacturers of the period were more than happy to oblige that obsession. There were small, delicate forks made exclusively for oysters, knives and forks shaped specifically for handling fish, spoons sized with real precision for soup, entirely separate tools waiting patiently for the salad course, the sweets, and the fresh fruit. Some of the wealthiest households owned specialized pieces so obscure and so specific in purpose that even seasoned, experienced diners occasionally paused for a moment, genuinely uncertain what exactly they were meant to do with the strange little object sitting in front of them. The material itself carried its own considerable weight of meaning, in every sense of that phrase. Solid silver, often surprisingly heavy in the hand and polished to an almost mirror-like shine by servants whose entire job consisted of keeping it gleaming, announced the wealth of the household anew with every single course that arrived. Owning enough matched silver to lay out a dozen individual pieces at each place setting, for a table seating perhaps 20 or 30 guests, represented a genuine fortune all on its own. The forks arranged in front of you were never simply tools for eating. They were, in a very real sense, money arranged carefully in gleaming rows, catching the candlelight and quietly daring you to make even a single visible mistake. And mistakes, when they happen, were always noticed, without exception. No one would ever correct you out loud, because pointing out another guest's error directly was itself considered a fairly serious breach of manners. Instead, your small fumble simply registered quietly in the minds of those around you. the lady seated beside you would catch it. A servant standing along the wall would catch it. Somewhere further down the long table, someone else entirely would catch it too, filing the moment away as a small, quietly delicious piece of evidence that you did not, in fact, truly belong at this table. In this particular world, the cruelest judgments of all were consistently the ones delivered in complete, unbroken silence. The safest available strategy, and the one instinctively adopted by nearly every nervous newcomer who ever sat at a table like this one, was simply to watch a more confident neighbor closely and copy their exact choice a half-second later. You waited to see which specific fork your neighbor selected for a given course, and then quietly selected the identical one yourself, doing your best to make the choice look like an entirely independent decision, rather than the careful imitation it actually was. It amounted to a kind of small, harmless cheating, but it was survivable, and at this particular table, survival was really the only goal that mattered. So you find yourself staring down at the gleaming rows of forks and spoons flanking your plate on both sides, a small silver army awaiting deployment, and you quietly remind yourself of the one rule you actually managed to remember: outside in, one utensil per course. You can do this, you tell yourself. Then the very first course of the evening arrives at your place setting, and you glance down at the careful arrangement in front of you, only to realize, with a small cold flush of genuine panic, that you have already lost track of which particular fork is which. It is, you begin to understand, going to be a very long evening indeed. The French MENUA small, elegantly printed card sits near your plate, and it turns out on closer inspection to be the evening's menu, written entirely in French. This is not, you quickly realize, some kind of accident or oversight. In Gilded Age high society, printing the dinner menu in French deliberately signaled sophistication and refinement, and it also, quite conveniently, served to separate the guests who genuinely belonged from the guests who were, at best, merely visiting for the evening. You squint down at unfamiliar words like consommé, risque de veau, and suprême de volaille, and you slowly, uncomfortably realize that you have no real idea what is actually about to be placed in front of you. Asking anyone at the table for a quick translation is completely out of the question, because openly admitting you cannot read French at a dinner like this one is roughly equivalent to admitting, out loud, that you simply wandered in off the street a few hours ago. So you nod knowingly at the small printed card in front of you. You understand, in reality, essentially nothing written on it. You commit fully, and with as much confidence as you can manage, to the bit. It's worth understanding, first, exactly why the menu was printed in French at all, in the middle of what was otherwise an entirely American dinner party attended by English-speaking guests. French had long been considered, throughout much of the Western world, the language of serious, elevated cuisine, the language of the great chefs and the grand European restaurants that had helped define the very idea of fine dining. Printing your own dinner menu in French draped the entire meal in an air of imported European refinement. It signaled that your household's kitchen was to be taken seriously, that your chef was likely French or at least trained carefully in the French style, and that your family understood and appreciated the finer things in life. It also, quite conveniently, filtered the room in real time, since the genuinely cultured guests were expected to read the menu with easy fluency, while the pretenders were left quietly squinting at unfamiliar words, trying desperately not to look confused. The menu card itself was often, in its own right, a genuine small work of art. Printed on fine card stock, sometimes decorated with delicate illustrations, occasionally even personalized for the specific occasion, it listed out each course in careful order, allowing guests to see, in advance, the full magnificent journey that lay ahead of them for the evening. In the very grandest of households, these small cards might even be kept afterward as souvenirs, tiny physical keepsakes of an unusually extravagant evening. To you, however, this same beautiful little card reads less like a charming souvenir and rather more like a coded threat, A written list of entirely unfamiliar dishes that you will, in fairly short order, be expected to eat correctly and enthusiastically. The words themselves formed a kind of maze all on their own. Consommé, you might eventually gather from context, referred to a clear, refined soup. Riz de veau, in a genuinely cruel twist of culinary language, did not refer to anything resembling bread or sweetness at all, but rather to a specific organ from a calf. Suprême de volaille turned out to be a refined, elegantly prepared chicken dish. Every single line on the menu held its own small trap, a dish that sounded elegant and faintly mysterious, giving you absolutely no reliable clue whether you were about to be served fish, fowl, organ meat, or something else you might genuinely prefer not to identify too closely. And here was the true cruelty buried in the whole situation. You simply could not ask for help. Turning quietly to your dinner partner and requesting even a brief translation would instantly reveal, beyond any doubt, that you did not actually read French, which, in this particular company, amounted to a quiet, unmistakable confession that you did not truly belong among them. So you were left with little choice but to bluff your way through it, nodding at the card with an expression of pleasant, practiced recognition, murmuring that the evening's menu looked absolutely delightful, all while having no real idea whatsoever what most of the words in front of you actually meant. There was, thankfully, at least one small advantage buried within this whole ordeal. Because the various courses arrived one at a time throughout the evening and were frequently announced or carefully served by attentive footmen, you could often simply wait patiently and see exactly what appeared on your plate before drawing any firm conclusions. The menu told you in advance that a particular course was coming. The plate itself, once it finally arrived, eventually told you what that course actually was. Between those two pieces of information, you might just manage to piece together enough understanding, course by course, to avoid any truly serious disaster. So you set the beautiful little printed card back down beside your plate, doing your best to project the confident air of someone who reads elegant French dinner menus as a matter of ordinary routine, when in reality you have successfully decoded perhaps one single word on the entire card, and remain genuinely uncertain you've even gotten that one correct. The very first course of the evening is already on its way toward the table. You will, it seems, be meeting each individual dish as a complete surprise, smiling warmly throughout as though you had expected exactly this all along. Part 8. The endless courses begin before the first plate even arrives. You brace yourself and learn a truly sobering truth about the evening ahead. This meal, by any reasonable definition, has no real end in sight. A formal Gilded Age dinner could stretch across 10, 15, sometimes 20 separate courses, unfolding over 3 hours or more of relentless, carefully paced eating, all while being closely watched. Soup, fish, meat, game, sweets, savories, and any number of dishes you cannot possibly identify arrive in a slow, steady, seemingly endless tide. Each individual course is small in portion, which is really the only thing that makes survival even theoretically possible, but the sheer accumulated number of them defeats almost everyone who isn't thoroughly trained for the ordeal. Refusing food outright at any point is considered deeply impolite. This is not, in any meaningful sense, simply a meal. It is a marathon, complete with a formal dress code, and somewhere around course number 7, sealed inside a corset or a collar that no longer permits particularly deep breathing, you begin to quietly suspect that you may not physically make it all the way to dessert. The underlying reason for this endless procession was a particular style of formal service that had taken over fashionable dining by this point in the century. One in which dishes were brought out course by course, in careful sequence, by a steady, continuous stream of household servants. Rather than loading the entire table with food all at once and allowing guests to simply help themselves as they pleased, each individual course was presented, portioned, served, eaten, and then cleared away entirely before the next course ever arrived. This meant the meal unfolded like a slow, stately theatrical performance, one carefully staged act at a time, stretching across hours. And each of those individual acts was, in its own right, a small production. A single course was never simply a plate of food set down and quietly forgotten about. It was carried in with real ceremony, offered properly, portioned with care, accompanied by its own specifically chosen wine, and eventually cleared away again, all according to a precise, practiced choreography performed by footmen who had done this exact routine countless times before. Multiply that entire careful ritual by 20 separate courses, and you begin to understand why a single formal dinner could comfortably devour an entire evening. The sheer variety involved was genuinely staggering to consider. You might begin with oysters, move steadily through one or two different soups, continue on to fish, proceed through a series of smaller elaborate main dishes, arrive eventually at a grand roast, move on to game, then salads, then sweets, then fresh fruit, then finally tiny savory bites served at the very end of the meal, with a cold palate-cleansing course sometimes slipped in partway through to reset your increasingly exhausted palate. Each individual course remained modest in size, which was really the only factor that made survival even theoretically achievable, but the sheer accumulated number of them still managed to defeat all but the most thoroughly seasoned diners at the table. And here lay perhaps the cruelest mechanic buried within the entire evening. You genuinely could not simply opt out of any of it. Waving away course after course, or leaving plate after plate conspicuously untouched, risked making you look ungracious, ungrateful, or even visibly unwell, drawing precisely the kind of unwanted attention you had spent the entire evening trying so carefully to avoid. So you were expected, without exception, to accept and at least taste your way politely through this entire endless sequence, managing at least a small, polite bite of each individual dish. Even as your appetite gradually vanished entirely, your stomach began quietly protesting, and your carefully fitted garments reached the outer limits of their structural engineering. The endurance required of you here was as much physical as it was purely social. Sitting upright for 3 or 4 continuous hours, laced tightly or starched rigidly into unforgiving formal wear, maintaining constant light conversation while sampling dish after dish and sip after sip of accompanying wine, was, quite genuinely, exhausting in a real physical sense. The wealthy guests around you had trained for exactly this kind of endurance their entire lives, without necessarily ever realizing it, in much the same way an athlete trains gradually over years. You, on the other hand, an unprepared newcomer to this entire world, were being thrown directly into the deep end of a competition you didn't even fully realize existed until this very evening. So you sit quietly as the plates continue arriving and departing in a hypnotic, seemingly infinite rhythm, each one presenting a fresh small challenge involving the correct utensil and the correct table manners. You have long since lost any accurate count of how many courses have passed. Your waistband is beginning to issue what feel like formal complaints, and when you finally, cautiously ask yourself how much longer this particular evening could possibly continue, the answer, delivered wordlessly by yet another footman quietly setting down yet another plate in front of you, remains reliably the same. Longer. Considerably longer than you were hopping. The oyster course, the very first course, finally arrives, and it is, predictably enough, oysters, because of course it is. Raw, cold, and glistening on a generous bed of crushed ice, they sit in front of you looking almost like they're daring you to eat them correctly on the very first try. In the Gilded Age, oysters were remarkably fashionable, and somewhat surprisingly to modern ears, genuinely abundant, hauled in from nearby waters by the millions, and served at the very start of nearly every important formal dinner across the city. There is naturally a specialized little fork designed exclusively for eating them properly, along with a precise, quiet technique for lifting each individual oyster cleanly from its shell without slurping loudly, splashing carelessly, or making the frankly understandable face that eating a raw mollusk tends to provoke in most first-timers. You carefully spear one with the small fork. It seems, in some strange way, to stare back up at you from the shell. You tip it carefully into your mouth and do your absolute best to look like this is something you genuinely enjoy and have always enjoyed throughout your entire life. Only 19 more courses remaining, by your rough count. To really understand the oyster's dominant reign at the fashionable dinner table, you have to first understand just how genuinely abundant the humble oyster once was along the American coast. The waters surrounding cities like New York teemed with oysters in what were, by any modern standard, almost unimaginable quantities. And they were harvested and sold throughout the city in truly staggering numbers. Far from being some kind of rare, expensive delicacy reserved only for the wealthy, oysters were eaten enthusiastically by nearly everyone in the city, from the wealthiest households on Fifth Avenue down to the humblest working-class street stalls scattered throughout lower Manhattan. Dedicated oyster sellers and casual oyster saloons flourished on practically every corner, serving them by the generous plateful to anyone carrying even a few spare coins. In a very real sense, the oyster functioned as something close to the fast food of its particular era. But at a genuinely fine formal dinner, the humble oyster was deliberately elevated into something closer to a proper occasion. Served raw and cold, arranged carefully on crushed ice, and typically offered right at the very start of the meal, it functioned as the elegant, refined opening note of the entire evening's carefully staged performance. Its presence at the table signaled freshness, wealth, and current fashion all at once, in a single confident gesture. Beginning a truly great formal dinner with a course of oysters was simply what one did in this particular world, and the finest households took quiet, genuine pride in the specific quality and precise geographic origin of the oysters they chose to serve their guests. Then, of course, there was the specialized fork itself. This being an era that seemed determined to manufacture a dedicated, purpose-built utensil for practically every conceivable task at the table, the humble oyster had earned its own small, distinctive three-tined fork, designed specifically for the delicate task of lifting the morsel cleanly from its shell. Using this particular fork correctly required a certain quiet finesse that wasn't immediately obvious to a newcomer. You held the shell steady in one hand, worked the small fork gently beneath the oyster to loosen it from the shell, and conveyed the whole thing to your mouth in one smooth, discreet motion, all without slurping audibly, dripping liquid onto the pristine tablecloth, or otherwise drawing unwanted attention to the fundamentally strange act of eating something that had been raw and quite recently alive, only minutes earlier. For the uninitiated guest, all of this presented an immediate crisis of nerve, right at the very start of the meal. A raw oyster is a genuinely challenging thing to eat gracefully, even for people who happen to enjoy them. And if you personally did not particularly enjoy the experience, you were still expected to consume the oyster with a convincing air of practiced pleasure regardless. Grimacing, even slightly, was simply not permitted. Hesitating for too long over the shell was noticed by those nearby. You couldn't poke at it suspiciously, or turn to your neighbor and ask exactly what you were supposed to do with the small accompanying wedge of lemon, or the strange little specialized fork sitting beside your plate. You simply had to perform genuine enjoyment convincingly, starting from the very first course of the entire evening, and that requirement was perhaps the single most daunting part of the whole experience. The oysters arrived first, which meant that your very opening move at this table, quite possibly the first thing the entire room might catch a glimpse of you doing, was navigating a slippery, unfamiliar raw mollusk using a specialized fork you had, in all likelihood, never actually held in your hand before tonight. There was no gentle warm-up course offered to ease you gradually into the evening. You were being tested immediately, right out of the gate, on shellfish, under warm candlelight in front of an entire room of watching strangers. So you steady the cool, ridged shell carefully in one hand, slide the small fork beneath the glistening oyster, and lift it toward your mouth with all the false confidence you can currently manage to summon. It slips down cold, briny, and strange. You set the now empty shell back down onto your plate without making a sound, and you carefully arrange your expression into something resembling mild, aristocratic satisfaction. You have survived the opening course of the evening, and already, somewhere further down the long, glittering table, the next round of plates is quietly being carried in. The soup course next comes the soup, and if you assume that at least this particular course would be relatively safe territory, you should probably think again. Even this humble bowl of soup is governed by its own small, exhausting set of rules. You must tilt the bowl gently away from your own body, never toward it, and spoon the soup outward, away from yourself, as though you're quietly rowing a very small boat across a shallow lake of warm broth. You sip carefully from the side of the spoon, never directly from its tip, and you make absolutely no audible sound whatsoever while doing so, because slurping soup at a table like this is precisely the kind of small mistake that gets quietly whispered about for an entire generation afterward. The spoon itself feels unusually large in your hand. The bowl is unusually shallow, and the whole careful process seems almost specifically engineered to catch you out in some small, visible mistake. Let's begin with the strange, specific choreography of the spoon itself, because this was a rule that practically everyone at the table already knew instinctively, and that practically every newcomer secretly feared getting wrong. You dipped the spoon carefully into the soup, and then moved it steadily away from your own body, toward the far edge of the bowl, rather than dragging it back toward yourself the way instinct might otherwise suggest. The polite, official explanation usually involved avoiding unsightly drips down the front of your formal clothing, but in reality, it was simply the accepted, expected way of doing things. A small, subtle, learned motion that instantly revealed, to anyone paying attention, whether or not you had actually been raised eating at tables exactly like this one. Move the spoon in the wrong direction, even once, and you had quietly announced yourself as an outsider without needing to say a single word. Then there was the broader matter of sound, which was treated throughout the meal with genuine, unwavering seriousness. Soup, specifically, was meant to be consumed in something close to total silence. No audible slurping, no loud, obvious sipping sounds, no scraping of metal spoon against porcelain bowl. You brought the spoon carefully to your mouth and sipped quietly from its side, rather than tipping the entire contents in from the tip the way you might eat soup at home, drawing the liquid in slowly and without any real spectacle. In a room where every small sound seemed somehow amplified by the general hush of careful good manners, a single accidental slurp could ring out almost as loudly as a dropped serving tray. The bowl and spoon themselves seemed to quietly conspire against you throughout this entire process. Formal soup courses were often served in unusually wide, shallow bowls or plates, rather than the deeper vessels you might be used to, which made the required outward spooning motion somewhat easier to execute correctly, but also left considerably less margin for error along the way. And the spoon provided was invariably large, rounded, and noticeably heavy, requiring a genuinely steady and confident hand to lift a full, generous portion of hot liquid smoothly up to your lips without the faintest wobble, and without splashing even a single drop onto the immaculate white damask tablecloth spread out beneath you. There was, it turns out, even a specific bit of etiquette governing exactly how you were meant to finish the course. As you neared the bottom of the bowl, you were permitted to tilt it slightly away from yourself in order to gather up the last remaining spoonfuls, but only ever tilting away, never toward yourself. And once you were finished, or had decided you were finished enough, you rested your spoon in a specific, recognized position within the bowl, silently signaling to the ever-watchful household servants that this particular course, at least for you, had reached its conclusion. Every single stage of even this humble soup course carried its own small, specific script to follow. It's genuinely worth pausing to appreciate just how thoroughly absurd all of this actually was, when you step back and look at it honestly. Soup is, at its core, perhaps the simplest, most inherently comforting food imaginable, something most people learn to eat as small children without a second thought. And yet here, in this particular setting, it had been transformed into a delicate, high-stakes test of coordination, silence, and carefully learned physical motion, performed entirely under the close, watchful eyes of an entire room full of people fully prepared to judge you for the smallest slip. A dish that had been designed, across the whole of human history, primarily to warm and soothe people, had become, in this specific context, simply another quiet opportunity to expose yourself as someone who did not truly belong. So you take up the large, heavy spoon in your hand, dip it carefully into the soup, and push it gently away from you across the shallow bowl, lifting it slowly and silently to sip from its side without producing the faintest audible sound. Your hand trembles just slightly, sending a small ripple briefly across the surface of the soup. Nobody at the table comments on it out loud. Nobody ever does, not directly. But the small ripple has been seen regardless, and it has quietly been noted by someone nearby. And you still have somewhere around 18 additional courses of increasingly complicated food patiently waiting ahead of you tonight. Part 9. The fish course. Now the fish course glides in, carried by a silent footman, and with it arrives yet another round of specialized weaponry laid carefully beside your plate. There is a fish fork and a fish knife, both shaped quite differently from their ordinary dinner counterparts, and reaching instead for a standard knife to attack your fish is exactly the kind of error that reveals you as an outsider almost instantly to anyone watching closely. The fish itself arrives elegantly boned, gently sauced, and presented with real delicacy, and you are expected to eat your way through it without flipping it awkwardly, mangling the presentation, or accidentally launching a stray piece of it clean across the table into the lap of a passing countess. The real trick here is to look as though you have eaten sole in cream sauce 1,000 times before in your life, and have found the whole experience, if anything, mildly boring by now. Internally, of course, you are performing a series of frantic mental calculations about exactly which utensil is which. Externally, you must appear serenely, effortlessly, aristocratically unbothered by any of it. Let's start with the specialized tools themselves, because the fish course arrived armed with its own peculiar, dedicated set. A fish knife was shaped quite differently from a regular dinner knife, typically broader, and often featuring a distinctive curved blade, designed not for cutting through tough cuts of meat, but rather for gently separating delicate flakes of fish, and easing them carefully away from any small bones that might remain. Alongside it sat a matching fish fork, slightly different in shape from the standard dinner fork you might otherwise reach for out of habit. Reaching instead for an ordinary knife to attack your fish was a small but genuinely glaring blunder, the kind of mistake that experienced, well-trained diners registered instantly and without needing to think twice, while less experienced outsiders often never even realized they had committed it in the first place. The fish itself had typically been prepared specifically to appear elegant and entirely unthreatening on the plate. It arrived filleted or very carefully boned in the kitchen beforehand, dressed in some kind of refined sauce, and presented in such a way that it could be eaten with genuine grace rather than wrestled with awkwardly at the table. This was decidedly not a whole fish staring up at you from the plate with its head still attached. It was a civilized, sauced, thoroughly boneless offering, carefully engineered for delicate, effortless-looking consumption. And yet, even given this genteel presentation, there remained ample room for quiet disaster in the hands of a nervous first-time guest. The great, persistent fear throughout this course was always the stray bone. Even in fish that had been carefully prepared and boned in advance, a single small bone might occasionally survive the process, and dealing with its unexpected discovery presented its own delicate minefield of etiquette. You could not simply spit it out onto your plate in front of everyone. You could not make any kind of visible production out of discovering it. You certainly could not recoil dramatically in alarm at the table. There existed quiet, discreet, practiced ways of removing such an obstacle from your mouth with minimal fuss and maximum outward composure, and knowing exactly how to handle that particular moment gracefully was, itself, Yet another small mark of proper upbringing that you may or may not have actually possessed. Then there was the broader matter of pace and portion size throughout the course. Like virtually every other course in this endless meal, the fish was meant to be eaten in small, measured, unhurried bites, without any visible haste and without any obvious display of genuine eagerness. You cut small, carefully controlled portions using the fish knife, lifted each one delicately with the fish fork, and chewed slowly and without any apparent hurry, all while simultaneously maintaining light, pleasant conversation with whichever dinner partner had currently been assigned to you for this stretch of the meal. Successfully eating, talking, and behaving flawlessly, all three at once, represented essentially the entire compressed skill set required to survive this particular evening. And underneath all of it ran the same relentless, unbroken current of quiet observation that had followed you since you first walked through the front door. The fish course arrived relatively early in the overall sequence of the meal, which meant the room around you remained fresh. The other guests remained fully alert, and any small misstep on your part would be caught by rested, attentive eyes, rather than the increasingly weary, wine-softened gazes that would develop later in the evening. Choosing the wrong utensil here, mishandling a stray bone poorly, or eating with clumsy, visible enthusiasm at this relatively early stage of the meal risked setting an unfortunate early impression that would likely color how you were judged for the entire remainder of the night. So you select what you sincerely hope is the correctly shaped fish knife and fish fork from the array beside your plate, and you work carefully at the delicate, sauced fillet in front of you, taking small, controlled, unhurried bites while chatting pleasantly all the while, as though none of this required a single ounce of real concentration on your part. A tiny bone reveals itself unexpectedly partway through. You deal with it as discreetly as you possibly can, or at least you sincerely hope you have. You set your specialized tools down at what you believe is the proper resting angle, and you brace yourself internally, because the fish course, as demanding as it's already proven to be, was really only ever meant as a warm-up. The genuinely heavy courses are still coming. The middle entres and the parade of Dishespe now. The individual courses have begun to blur together somewhat in your memory, and here come the entrees and the removes. A rotating cast of rich, elaborate dishes, specifically designed to keep the meal grinding relentlessly forward without ever quite letting up. In Gilded Age dining terminology, the entrees were the smaller, elaborately prepared dishes served between the larger courses, small creations swimming in rich sauces and stacked high with garnishes you genuinely cannot begin to name. Just as you finish one plate, a silent servant appears and whisks it away, replacing it almost instantly with another, and then another after that, in a hypnotic, unending cycle that seems specifically built to slowly, methodically break your spirit over the course of the evening. You are not hungry anymore. In fact, you stopped being genuinely hungry 3 or 4 courses ago, but stopping is simply not an option here. So you take one more polite bite of everything that arrives, quietly praying that your straining waistband can somehow hold the line for a while longer. Let's untangle some of the terminology here, since the middle stretch of a Gilded Age dinner carried its own specific vocabulary designed, almost seemingly on purpose, to confuse anyone not already thoroughly familiar with it. The entrees were not, as the modern use of that word might suggest, the main event of the meal. They were, instead, the smaller, fancier, elaborately made dishes, typically served in rich sauces, positioned in the stretch of the meal between the fish course and the great roast still to come. The removes, meanwhile, were the more substantial courses that followed and, in a real sense, replaced the entrees at the center of the meal's overall architecture. It was an entire structured system of eating, carefully layered and sequenced, that everyone else at the table seemed to understand instinctively, except, of course, for you. These particular middle courses were where the household's kitchen truly showed off its full range of skill. A talented chef poured genuine creativity into these smaller, elaborate dishes, sculpting and saucing and garnishing them into little edible showpieces meant to impress and delight. Each individual dish was designed specifically to demonstrate skill and expense, and to keep the overall parade of culinary novelty marching steadily along so that no single guest ever grew visibly bored throughout the long meal. Each new dish that arrived represented a genuinely fresh flavor, a fresh visual presentation, and for you specifically, one more fresh puzzle to solve regarding which utensil to select, and exactly how to eat the thing gracefully without embarrassing yourself. Somewhere in the middle of this long stretch of courses, in the very grandest of formal dinners, came a small, welcome mercy disguised as just another course. A cold palate cleanser, sometimes a light sorbet, sometimes an icy, lightly spiked punch, was served partway through the meal specifically to refresh an exhausted, overworked palate. According to the prevailing culinary theory of the era, this brief cold interlude was meant to revive a guest's flagging appetite in preparation for the heavier, richer courses still waiting ahead. It amounted to a brief, genuinely cool pause in the midst of an otherwise relentless procession of rich food, a small chance to reset before things grew even heavier. It also, somewhat alarmingly, confirmed something you had already begun to suspect, that this entire meal had been deliberately engineered to continue well past the natural point of feeling comfortably full. The overall rhythm of this stretch of the meal was, in its own strange way, both hypnotic and genuinely merciless. A plate would arrive in front of you. You would eat a portion of it. And before you had quite finished, a footman would already be appearing silently at your shoulder, ready to clear the plate away and set down whatever came next. There was no real lingering allowed, no long, comfortable pause between courses, no real chance to quietly catch your breath and recover before the next challenge arrived. The courses simply came and went with the steady, unstoppable regularity of a well-oiled machine, and you were expected, throughout all of it, to keep pace while maintaining a pleasant smile fixed firmly in place. By this particular stage of the evening, the real ongoing challenge had shifted somewhat. It was no longer primarily a matter of specialized knowledge about forks and proper technique. You had, more or less, figured out the general rhythm of things by now. What defeated you instead, increasingly, was sheer physical volume. The genuine physical reality of consuming polite bites of dish after rich dish while sealed tightly into unforgiving formal wear, all without ever appearing to visibly strain, flag, or privately wish that the whole elaborate affair would simply end already. Your body, if you're honest with yourself, had reached its practical limit several courses ago. The meal itself, unfortunately, very much had not. So the plates continue arriving, one after another, a steady blur of sauced and elaborately garnished creations that you can no longer reliably distinguish from one another in your own memory. Each one is swept away and instantly replaced before you've had a real chance to catch your breath and process what you just ate. You take another small, dutiful bite of whatever has just arrived. You murmur, as convincingly as you can manage, that it is truly wonderful. At this point in the evening, you are running almost entirely on manners and sheer stubborn willpower. And just when you dare to allow yourself a small flicker of hope that the end of the meal might finally be drawing near, another footman glides silently up to your side bearing yet another plate. The roast, you realize with a growing sense of quiet horror, has not even arrived yet. Part 10. The roast and the game course. Now arrives the heavy artillery of the meal, the roast and the game course. This represents the muscular, substantial heart of the entire dinner, where great cuts of beef, saddles of mutton, and wild game make their grand, ceremonial entrance onto the table. And in the very finest Gilded Age homes, this often meant serving genuine delicacies like canvasback duck and terrapin, a rich stew made from a particular species of turtle that the truly wealthy adored, and that cost a genuine small fortune to properly prepare and serve. To the guests seated around you, terrapin represents a rare and thrilling treat, something to be savored and admired. To you, it looks and smells like a bowl of warm, faintly mysterious liquid that you must somehow consume with visible enthusiasm and the correct implement, all while maintaining perfect composure. You take a careful, cautious bite. It tastes, if you're being honest with yourself, like the ocean and a nearby swamp had a serious disagreement somewhere in the preparation. You smile warmly regardless. You murmur that it is simply divine. You have, at this point in the evening, officially learned how to lie convincingly with your entire face. Understand, first, that these particular courses were always meant to genuinely impress, the ones specifically designed to announce the wealth and considerable ambition of the household as loudly as possible. A grand roast, a saddle of mutton, a magnificent joint of beef, carved tableside with real ceremony by a skilled servant. These were the substantial, splendid centerpieces around which the entire architecture of the meal had, in a sense, been quietly building toward all evening. After the delicate oysters, the silent, carefully spooned soup, the refined fish course, and the elaborate parade of smaller entrees, the arrival of the great roast represented the meal finally flexing its full muscle. The game course, meanwhile, pushed things into even more rarefied territory. Wild birds and game meats were prized specifically for their difficulty to obtain and their considerable expense, and serving them at your table signaled, unmistakably, a household operating at the very highest order of culinary ambition. Among the most coveted options available was canvasback duck, a particular wild duck famous throughout the era for its distinctive flavor, and hunted under conditions that made it both genuinely costly and highly fashionable to serve. Offering canvasback duck to your guests was, in effect, serving status itself on a plate, a dish the entire table would immediately recognize as the unmistakable mark of a truly serious, well-funded kitchen. And then there was terrapin, perhaps the single strangest luxury of the entire era, at least by modern standards. This was a rich stew prepared from a specific type of turtle, cooked through an elaborate, labor-intensive process, and regarded by wealthy diners of the period as one of the genuine great delicacies available to them. It was expensive to obtain, laborious to prepare correctly, and deeply fashionable among the sort of people who prided themselves on knowing exactly which dishes were currently in vogue. It was precisely the sort of dish that appeared consistently at the very finest dinners, specifically because it was so difficult and costly to produce well. To the wealthy guests around you, a serving of terrapin represented a genuine culinary thrill. To an outsider encountering it for the very first time, it arrived instead as a warm, rich, faintly aquatic mystery, served up in a shallow bowl with its own dedicated spoon. Here, then, was the quiet trap that the game course laid specifically for someone in your position tonight. These dishes were unfamiliar, strongly and distinctively flavored, and entirely foreign in taste to anyone who hadn't been raised eating them from childhood. And yet you were expected to receive each one not merely with polite acceptance, but with genuine, visible delight. Recoiling even slightly from the terrapin, hesitating too long over an unfamiliar cut of game, or failing to properly recognize the honor being extended to you through this particular course, would have marked you out instantly to everyone watching. You had to perform genuine connoisseurship, nodding appreciatively at the canvasback duck, even if you privately harbored strong reservations about it, savoring the terrapin as though it were some cherished, familiar old friend, rather than the strangest thing you had ever willingly put in your mouth. The correct tools and proper techniques added their own usual layer of difficulty to the proceedings. Game meats and roasts arrived with their own specific implements, and their own quiet, unspoken expectations about exactly how they ought to be cut, portioned, and eaten with appropriate grace. But by this particular point in the meal, the deeper, more pressing challenge had become genuinely psychological rather than purely technical. You were full. You were tired. You were facing entirely unfamiliar food that challenged your palate in ways you hadn't anticipated. And you were still required to greet all of it with the same easy, practiced enthusiasm of someone who dined exactly this way, every single night of their life, without a second thought. So you accept your portion of the prized canvasback duck, along with your carefully measured share of the celebrated terrapin, and you eat both with an expression of deep, knowing pleasure plastered carefully across your face, while your body quietly, insistently begs you to simply stop. The terrapin tastes, as far as you can tell, like a swamp in an ocean somewhere settling an old dispute directly in your mouth. You call it divine anyway. You call it exquisite. You have, by this point in the evening, thoroughly mastered the single most essential Gilded Age survival skill of all, lying gracefully, with a full mouth and a dangerously straining waistband, while somehow maintaining perfect composure. And the meal, almost unbelievably, is still not over. The wine pairings. Let's turn our attention now to the small forest of glasses standing patiently to your right, because each and every one of those endless courses arrives paired with its own specifically chosen wine. A proper Gilded Age formal dinner poured a different wine for nearly every distinct stage of the meal. Sherry accompanied the soup. A crisp white wine arrived with the fish. Claret and champagne appeared as the courses climbed steadily toward their richest, grandest peak. Each individual wine was served in its own specific, slightly different shaped glass. Servants materialized seemingly out of thin air to refill your glass constantly, almost the instant it dips even slightly below full. And here lies a particularly cruel trap buried within all this generous hospitality. Drink too little throughout the evening, and you risk appearing stiff, ungracious, and faintly insulting to a host who has clearly spent a genuine fortune assembling these fine wines specifically for tonight. Drink too much, on the other hand, and you become the story that everyone quietly tells about this particular dinner for years afterward. Somewhere between your fourth and fifth glass, with your corset or your unforgiving collar quietly cutting off just a bit more of your circulation with every passing hour, you begin to realize that you are being gently, elegantly, and quite expensively poisoned by pure, generous hospitality. Let's start with the underlying logic behind these wine pairings, because it followed the arriving food with genuine, careful precision. Different wines were deliberately matched to different courses throughout the meal, each one chosen specifically to complement whatever you happen to be eating at that particular moment. A fortified wine like sherry might accompany the soup course. A crisp, light white wine was typically poured to go alongside the fish. Richer red wines like claret arrived alongside the heavier meats and game courses, and sparkling champagne bubbled up as the meal reached its grandest, most celebratory heights. Sweet dessert wines arrived even later, alongside the sweets course near the very end. The whole careful progression amounted to a kind of composed liquid soundtrack, deliberately layered underneath the arriving food throughout the evening. This, naturally, meant a different glass was required for nearly every single wine being served, which is precisely why your place setting had sprouted an entire cluster of crystal glassware in the first place. There were glasses of varying shapes and sizes, each one intended for one particular kind of wine, arranged carefully near your plate in their own small, deliberate formation. To the genuinely practiced diner, all of this simply represented the natural, unremarkable order of things. To you, it represented one more layer of possible failure, one more crystal forest in which reaching confidently for the wrong glass at exactly the wrong moment offered, yet another quiet opportunity to expose yourself as someone who didn't fully belong at this particular table. The attentive household servants made genuine moderation surprisingly difficult throughout the meal. Watchful footmen moved constantly around the table, refilling glasses almost the very instant they dipped even slightly below full, which meant you often couldn't even accurately track how much wine you had actually consumed over the course of the evening. Your glass simply never seemed to run empty for very long. Over the course of a meal spanning many separate courses and many hours, this quiet, relentless topping up could carry you well past sensible, comfortable limits before you had any real, clear sense of exactly how far you'd actually gone. And this created what was arguably the evening's most treacherous social tightrope of all. Drinking too little throughout the meal looked stiff, ungracious, and faintly insulting toward a host who had gone to such considerable expense and effort. But drinking too much represented a catastrophic failure of an entirely different kind, becoming visibly tipsy, growing noticeably loud, saying something genuinely unwise in front of the wrong person, losing your carefully maintained composure at a table where composure was, quite simply, everything. Any of these could undo an entire evening's worth of otherwise flawless behavior in a single unguarded, careless moment. You had to sip enough wine throughout the meal to appear genuinely appreciative of the hospitality being extended to you, while somehow stopping well short of disaster, all without any clear, reliable marker indicating exactly where that particular line actually sat. The physical reality of the situation made everything considerably more difficult to manage. You were steadily consuming wine after wine on a stomach already compressed tightly by a corset, or a body constrained throughout by a rigid, unforgiving collar, in an unusually warm room lit by dozens of flickering candles, over the course of several continuous hours. The accumulated heat, the tight, restrictive clothing, the rich, heavy food, and the steady, continuous flow of wine all combined together into a slow, creeping mental haze. Staying genuinely sharp, upright, and articulate under these particular combined conditions represented its own quiet feat of physical and mental endurance, one that the truly seasoned guests around you managed with what looked like effortless, maddening ease. So you sip carefully from what you sincerely hope is the correct glass for this particular course, trying your best to appear both genuinely appreciative and entirely in full control of yourself, while yet another attentive footman glides up beside you to refill a glass you had, in truth, barely even touched yet. The warm candlelight around the table seems to have grown just slightly softer now. The surrounding conversation feels a little warmer and easier than it did an hour ago. Your own judgment feels, if you're honest with yourself, just a touch looser than it probably should. Somewhere past your fifth glass of the evening, you finally begin to understand the true, quiet danger hidden within Gilded Age hospitality. It never attacks you directly. It simply keeps pouring, smiling warmly all the while, until you eventually, quietly defeat yourself. Part 11. The rule of never appearing hungry here is a rule that will quietly haunt you for the entire remainder of the evening. You must never, under any circumstances, appear to actually want the food in front of you. In Gilded Age high society, visible hunger was considered genuinely vulgar, a clear sign that you were somehow not accustomed to abundance, that this level of extravagant feasting represented something unusual or special to you rather than an ordinary, expected part of everyday life. So even as some 20 separate courses parade steadily past you in an endless, glittering tide, you are expected to eat lightly, delicately, and with an air of faint, practiced indifference, as though this entire staggering feast is simply another unremarkable Tuesday evening, rather beneath your genuine notice. Clean your plate too eagerly at any point, and you look like a starving stranger who somehow snuck in uninvited. Devour the terrapin with obvious, visible joy, and you have thoroughly, unmistakably exposed yourself. The wealthy guests around you have spent their entire lives performing boredom at their own lavish banquets, and now, apparently, so must you, nibbling delicately like some small, disinterested bird, while your own stomach quietly files a formal complaint against the whole arrangement. Let's take a moment to understand the strange underlying logic buried beneath this particular rule, because it reveals quite a lot about the world you have found yourself wandering into tonight. To the genuinely deeply wealthy, abundance itself was simply ordinary. Extraordinary food served in truly vast quantity appeared before them constantly, at meal after meal, occasion after occasion. Treating that abundance as unremarkable was, in itself, a quiet display of status. To show visible excitement about a lavish meal, to eat as though you were genuinely hungry, or as though this particular food represented some rare and special treat, betrayed the uncomfortable truth that this level of abundance was not, in fact, your own everyday reality. Deliberate restraint, on the other hand, signaled that you belonged to a class of people for whom all of this splendor was simply routine, unremarkable background noise. This turned every single course of the meal into its own small performance of practiced indifference. The oysters, the soup, the elaborate entrees, the prized game, all of it was meant to be sampled lightly and then set gently aside, tasted rather than genuinely eaten, appreciated with a kind of cool, detached interest rather than any hint of vulgar enthusiasm. You took modest, carefully measured bites throughout. You deliberately left food on your plate on purpose at the end of nearly every course. You treated a feast that quite literally represented a small fortune as though it were pleasant enough, certainly, but ultimately unimportant. A mere backdrop to the far more important business of polite conversation happening around it. For a genuinely hungry newcomer in your particular position tonight, this amounted to a special, refined kind of torture. Here was more magnificent, carefully prepared food than you had perhaps ever seen assembled in one place in your entire life, course after course of it, and you were explicitly forbidden from actually enjoying any of it in any visible, outward way. Your body wanted, quite understandably, to eat. Your instincts wanted to appreciate and savor these rare, elaborate dishes laid out in front of you. And the unwritten rules of the evening demanded, without exception, that you suppress all of that entirely, that you push the food around your plate with practiced delicacy, and wear an expression of mild, aristocratic boredom throughout the entire ordeal. The performance extended well beyond simply your fork and your plate. You were meant to appear, throughout the meal, considerably more interested in the surrounding conversation than in the food itself, more genuinely engaged with your assigned dinner partner than with whatever dish currently sat in front of you. Eating itself was meant to appear almost incidental, something your hands quietly did in the background while your real, visible attention floated elsewhere entirely, toward witty conversation and gracious company. To be caught gazing hungrily at an approaching course as it made its way toward the table, or eating any dish with obvious, visible relish, was to reveal an appetite you were supposed to be, in this particular social context, far above having in the first place. There was, if you stopped to consider it, a deeper cruelty buried within this rule than in any single specific fork or wine glass. The entire lavish meal, all of that considerable expense, effort, and endless procession of genuine luxury, existed, in part, specifically to be conspicuously underappreciated by the very people it had been designed to impress in the first place. The abundance itself was the entire point of the display, and treating that abundance as though it were nothing remarkable represented the real, ultimate flex. You were surrounded, quite literally, by riches that you were simultaneously required to find utterly unremarkable, so you sit amid this genuine ocean of food, honestly hungry beneath your composed exterior, quietly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it all, and you eat like some small, uncertain bird who isn't even fully sure it wants the seed in front of it. You take the smallest possible polite bites. You leave beautifully prepared dishes half-finished on your plate without a second thought. You keep your expression carefully cool and your visible attention fixed firmly on the ongoing conversation, performing a boredom you genuinely do not feel about a feast you would, if given any real choice in the matter, very much like to actually sit down and eat properly. In the Gilded Age, it turns out, even your own appetite had to learn how to lie convincingly. And right now, yours is proving to be a genuinely terrible liar. The table manners minefield beyond the forks, beyond the wine glasses, lies an entire additional battlefield of general table manners, and any single misstep within it can quietly undo you in an instant. Elbows resting on the table, strictly forbidden. Reaching directly across another guest for anything at all, simply unthinkable. Speaking with food still in your mouth, an absolute, unforgivable catastrophe. You must sit upright as rigidly as a fence post throughout the entire meal. Bring each bite of food carefully up toward your face, rather than lowering your face down toward the plate the way instinct might otherwise suggest. And keep your free hand resting properly in your lap according to the American style, or alternatively resting lightly on the table's edge according to the European style. And choosing incorrectly between these two options instantly announces to everyone at the table exactly where and how you originally learned your table manners. Every small gesture you make throughout the evening amounts to its own tiny performance, silently and continuously being graded by everyone around you. You have, by this point, hundreds of individual small chances to fail tonight, and you have already, if you're being honest, quietly used up several of them already. Let's start with posture, because it governed practically everything else about how you carried yourself throughout the meal. You were expected to sit straight and fully composed for the entire duration of dinner, shoulders held back, spine held upright, for the complete 3 or 4 hours the meal typically required. No slouching, even slightly, as fatigue inevitably set in. No leaning back comfortably in your chair at any point. No propping yourself up against the edge of the table when your body grew genuinely tired. The rigid, unforgiving formal clothing helped enforce this posture to some degree on its own, but the underlying social expectation ran considerably deeper than mere fabric. A properly well-bred person simply held themselves with visible control at the dinner table as a matter of course, and any visible collapse into comfort or relaxation revealed, instantly, a lack of proper early training. Then there were the hands, which came with their own strict, specific set of unwritten laws. Elbows never rested on the table's surface while you were actively eating. You did not gesture animatedly with a loaded fork in hand to emphasize some point you were making in conversation. You did not reach directly across a seated neighbor to retrieve something you wanted, but instead waited patiently for it to be passed to you, or quietly asked someone nearby to pass it along. Bread, when served, was broken carefully into small pieces using your fingers, rather than being cut with a knife or bitten into whole the way you might casually eat it at home. Each of these small rules represented a learned habit, entirely invisible and automatic to those who had been raised within this particular world since early childhood, and genuinely treacherous territory for those, like you, who had not been. The very way you handled your utensils throughout the meal could betray you instantly to a trained observer. There existed the American style of eating, in which you cut a piece of food, set the knife down carefully, switched the fork over to your other hand, and then lifted the bite to your mouth. And there existed, separately, the continental style, in which the fork remained fixed in place throughout, and both utensils stayed in more or less constant, simultaneous use. Neither approach was considered strictly wrong in itself, but the particular choice you made quietly signaled something about your background and your influences to anyone paying close attention, and executing either style clumsily, or switching awkwardly back and forth between the two without realizing it, drew exactly the kind of unwanted notice you had spent the entire evening hopping to avoid. Even the humble napkin carried its own small set of etiquette rules. You placed it carefully in your lap at the very start of the meal, never tucked into your collar the way you might tuck a bib around a small child. You used it discreetly throughout the meal to dab gently at your mouth, rather than scrubbing at it vigorously the way you might at home. When you paused briefly during the meal, your utensils rested in one specific position on your plate. And when you had genuinely finished with a particular course, they rested instead in a different, distinct position, silently signaling to the attentive household servants standing along the walls whether or not it was appropriate to clear your plate away yet. It amounted to an entire small, silent language of careful placement, understood instinctively by everyone else at the table and by the staff watching from the walls, but entirely foreign to you. What made all of this so genuinely exhausting to navigate was the sheer accumulated number of individual rules involved, combined with the total silence with which every violation was quietly judged. There was rarely any single, dramatic mistake capable of dooming you outright at a table like this one. Instead, there existed an endless field of tiny, individually minor missteps, any one of which might be noticed by someone nearby and quietly remembered for later. And critically, no one would ever actually tell you when you had erred. The disapproval remained entirely silent and internal, carefully filed away behind an unfailingly pleasant expression, which meant you never quite had any reliable way of knowing exactly how you were actually doing throughout the meal. So you sit rigidly upright throughout, elbows carefully tucked in against your sides, napkin properly arranged in your lap, having quietly chosen one utensil style or the other, and now praying you can commit to it convincingly for the rest of the meal, never reaching across the table, never gesturing carelessly with a loaded fork, never speaking through a mouthful of food, performing perhaps 100 small individual acts of physical control simultaneously, without ever letting any of it show on your face. It feels, in practice, rather like walking carefully through an entire field of invisible tripwires while simultaneously smiling warmly and making light, engaging conversation. You have, quite probably, already brushed against several of them without even realizing it. And the courses, mercifully or not, depending on your current state of exhaustion, keep right on coming. Part 12, Turning the Table. Now for perhaps the strangest rule of the entire evening, the one that quietly governs who you are even permitted to speak to at any given moment. It was called turning the table. For the first half of the meal, you speak exclusively to the dinner partner seated on one particular side of you. And then, at some invisible signal, quietly led by the hostess herself, the entire table pivots at once, and every guest switches over to converse instead with their partner on the opposite side. You do not get any say in this transition. You cannot simply choose to escape a dull, tedious conversation early, no matter how badly you might want to. If your first assigned partner happens to be genuinely fascinating, that's simply unfortunate timing, because the table turns regardless. And if your first partner turns out to be a tedious man describing his railway holdings in truly exhausting, granular detail, that's equally unfortunate, because until the table actually turns, he remains, for all practical purposes, your entire conversational world. Let's understand how this genuinely unusual mechanism actually worked in practice. At the very start of the meal, the hostess would turn to begin speaking with the gentleman seated on one particular side of her, and by doing so, she effectively set the direction for the entire table to follow. Taking their cue from her, every other guest present would turn in the same corresponding direction, each person beginning to converse with whichever partner happened to be seated on that particular side. Then, partway through the meal, the hostess would turn instead to her other neighbor, and the entire table would dutifully pivot along with her, everyone shifting their attention simultaneously to the partner seated on their opposite side. It amounted to a coordinated social maneuver, executed by an entire room full of people acting essentially in unison. The underlying purpose behind this custom was, at least in theory, a matter of basic fairness. The tradition ensured that both people seated on either side of any given guest received a reasonable, roughly equal share of conversation throughout the meal, so that no one guest was left sitting silently ignored, while their neighbor chatted happily away with someone on their other side. In a meal where seating arrangements and partner pairings had already been so rigidly, carefully organized in advance, this represented simply one more piece of overall orchestration. A deliberate way of distributing conversation evenly across the table, almost like a carefully managed shared resource. But for you, personally, it meant a genuine, total loss of control over your own social fate for the evening. You did not get to gravitate naturally toward whichever guest happened to be more interesting to you, nor drift quietly away from whichever guest happened to be less so. Your conversational partners were assigned entirely by the initial seating arrangement, and then further rationed out by the mechanical turning of the table at the hostess's discretion. For the first stretch of the meal, one particular neighbor was your only permitted conversational companion. For the second stretch, it became the other. Whether either one of them turned out to be genuinely bearable company was, ultimately, entirely a matter of luck. This particular custom created some genuinely excruciating situations, over the course of a long evening. Imagine, for instance, being seated beside a delightful, genuinely witty companion during the first half of the meal, deep in what is easily the best conversation of your entire evening, only to have the hostess suddenly turn, and the entire table swing away accordingly, forcing you to abandon that engaging conversation mid-thought and pivot, instead toward a complete stranger who apparently wishes to discuss the current weather in truly exhausting, granular detail. Or imagine the exact reverse scenario, being trapped for the entire first half of the meal beside someone genuinely insufferable, quietly watching the clock and silently praying for the eventual turn that will finally release you from their company. The whole system also demanded a certain constant vigilance on your part throughout the meal. You had to notice, in real time, exactly when the table turned, catching the subtle shift initiated quietly by the hostess so that you could pivot smoothly at the correct moment along with everyone else around you. Failing to notice the shift and continuing to talk animatedly to a partner who had already quietly turned away toward their other neighbor left you stranded awkwardly mid-sentence, effectively addressing the back of someone's head in front of the entire table. It represented one more small, subtle social cue you were somehow expected to read instinctively, without ever having been formally taught it. So you make conversation dutifully with whichever partner has been assigned to your one particular side, whether they happen to enchant you completely or bore you into a near stupor, and you wait, entirely powerless in the matter, for the invisible signal to eventually arrive. Eventually, the hostess turns. The entire table swings like some slow, coordinated tide, and you obediently pivot along with everyone else to face your other neighbor, beginning the entire process all over again from scratch. You have no meaningful say in any part of it. In the Gilded Age, it turns out, even the direction of your own dinner conversation was decided entirely for you, one graceful, coordinated turn at a time. Forbidden conversation TOPICS. So you're finally talking, engaged in what should be a fairly straightforward social activity. But there is a landmine buried in nearly every possible sentence you might choose to say, because polite dinner conversation in this world came bundled with a long, genuinely unforgiving list of forbidden subjects. You may not discuss money directly, which is deeply, almost comically ironic, given that literally everyone seated at this particular table is quietly drowning in it. You may not discuss politics. You may not discuss religion. You may not discuss illness, or anything even remotely unpleasant or distressing. You certainly may not ask your dinner partner any particularly direct personal questions, nor say anything that could reasonably be considered clever specifically at someone else's expense. What remains, once all of these categories have been carefully excluded, is a genuinely narrow little island of acceptable topics: the opera, the current weather, recent travel, and gentle, generic flattery. You must somehow be endlessly charming throughout the meal while saying, in any meaningful sense, absolutely nothing at all of substance. It feels rather like trying to win some strange game where the only permitted move available to you is to stand very still and compliment the wallpaper. Let's begin with money, the great unspoken subject of the entire evening, because its complete forbiddenness turns out to be perhaps the most genuinely revealing thing about this whole world. This was, after all, a room absolutely full of people whose entire lives revolved, in one way or another, around truly enormous accumulated wealth. And yet directly discussing that wealth, asking what something specific had cost, mentioning particular prices, fortunes, or personal income out loud, was considered deeply, unmistakably vulgar. Wealth itself was visibly everywhere throughout the evening, in the mansion's architecture, in the endless food, in the jewelry, in the silver spread across the table. But actually nomming that wealth aloud in so many words broke the entire carefully maintained spell. The genuinely rich, it seemed, generally preferred their money to be quietly felt by everyone present, rather than directly mentioned or discussed. Politics and religion formed the classic forbidden pairing, and for genuinely good reason. Both subjects carried real potential to spark honest disagreement, and disagreement at a formal, polite dinner represented a real breach of the careful social peace the entire occasion had been designed to preserve. You did not air your personal political views at this table. You did not debate matters of religious belief with your dinner partner. You did not wade into any subject at all on which reasonable, well-meaning guests might genuinely, passionately differ from one another. The overarching goal of the entire evening was harmony rather than honesty, and honesty, unfortunately, had an unfortunate habit of causing exactly the kind of friction everyone was trying so hard to avoid. Then came the broader, sprawling category of the generally unpleasant, which was to be avoided entirely, without exception. You did not discuss illness. You did not discuss death. You did not discuss any current scandal or anything grim, dark, or genuinely distressing in nature. You did not bring up your own personal troubles at the table, nor dwell for too long on anyone else's. Dinner conversation was meant throughout to remain light, pleasant, and thoroughly agreeable. A gentle, soothing hum in the background rather than anything that might actually provoke real thought or feeling. Introducing something genuinely dark or uncomfortable into the conversation was rather like abruptly turning off the music in the middle of a lively party. A small, quiet act of social sabotage that nobody would forgive easily. Personal questions represented their own particular delicate hazard throughout the meal. You did not interrogate your assigned dinner partner about private matters. You did not pry into their personal affairs, nor push any conversation toward anything too intimate too quickly, however naturally curious you might genuinely feel. Curiosity, however understandable and human, had to be carefully restrained behind an unfailingly polite surface at all times. And cleverness itself, ironically, became genuinely dangerous territory whenever it came at someone else's expense, however funny it might privately seem to you in the moment. Wit that wounded another guest, however sharp or genuinely amusing, made you appear untrustworthy and sharp-edged rather than charming and pleasant. What remained after all of these various prohibitions had been carefully applied amounted to a genuinely tiny territory of safe, approved subjects. The opera and the theater, recent personal travels, art in general terms, the current weather, harmless, gentle pleasantries, generous, well-placed compliments. Within this narrow remaining space, you were expected to somehow be delightful, genuinely engaging, and effortlessly charming, holding your assigned partner's sustained interest for the length of an extremely long meal, all without ever once straying accidentally into any of the forbidden territory surrounding you on every side. You had to be genuinely captivating while saying, functionally, nothing of any real substance whatsoever. So you steer carefully between all of these scattered landmines throughout the meal, praising an opera performance you may or may not have actually seen, remarking pleasantly on the unusually mild weather, inquiring gently about your partner's recent summer travels, offering warm, appropriately weightless compliments wherever they seem to fit naturally. You keep every genuinely interesting thought you might privately have locked firmly behind your teeth for the entire evening. And as you continue smiling and murmuring agreeable nothings for a third consecutive hour, you begin to genuinely understand the true underlying difficulty of the Gilded Age formal dinner. It was never really, at its core, about the food at all. It was about talking endlessly, charmingly, and entirely safely, without ever once accidentally saying anything of real substance whatsoever. Part 13. The Watchful Servants. Take a quiet moment, if you can spare one amid all this careful performing, to notice the household servants standing along the walls of the dining room, because they are, without question, noticing you right back. Standing silently against the walls throughout the meal is a small army of footmen and maids, dressed in crisp livery, sometimes numbering as many as one servant for every 2 guests in the very grandest of households. They move about constantly, clearing plates, refilling glasses, and quietly observing absolutely everything that happens at the table. These servants have been carefully trained to appear essentially invisible, and yet they see every single fumble, every wrong fork selected, every panicked sideways glance you make toward your neighbor's hands in an attempt to figure out what you're supposed to do next. And here is the quiet horror worth sitting with for a moment. Servants talk to one another. Gossip from below stairs traveled between the great houses of the city with something close to genuine electricity, which means your mistakes tonight might well become common knowledge in 3 or 4 other mansions across the city by the end of the week. Start with the sheer scale of the household staff involved, because a truly great household ran, in every practical sense, on an enormous supporting workforce. Serving a formal dinner of 15 or 20 separate courses to dozens of guests required a genuinely substantial team moving in careful, practiced coordination. Footmen assigned to carry, present, and clear each course. Others assigned specifically to pour and manage the various wines. Still more managing the constant flow of dishes between the kitchen and the dining room itself. In the grandest households, the ratio of servants to guests was genuinely lavish, ensuring that every single diner received near constant attention throughout the meal, and that the endless procession of courses arrived and departed with seamless, practiced precision. Their training, as a group, aimed specifically at a kind of dignified invisibility. A well-drilled footman moved quietly through the room, spoke only when absolutely necessary, and performed his various duties without ever seeming to intrude directly on the guests or their ongoing conversations. He was meant, in every sense, to fade smoothly into the background, functioning as a seamless part of the evening's larger machinery rather than as a person guests needed to consciously acknowledge. The overall illusion being maintained was that the food simply appeared and vanished on its own, carried along by entirely unseen hands. But invisible in this context did not mean unseeing. From their fixed positions along the walls and at your shoulder throughout the meal, the household servants maintained a clear, constant, unobstructed view of literally everything happening at the table. They saw exactly who reached for the wrong fork. They saw who fumbled awkwardly with the finger bowl. They saw who drank a little too freely as the evening wore on. They saw who glanced nervously toward a neighbor to figure out what to do next. They witnessed every small triumph and every quiet, private disaster over the course of the evening, all while maintaining perfectly neutral facial expressions that betrayed absolutely nothing of what they had observed. And this is precisely where the real underlying danger lay for you tonight, because the world existing below stairs maintained its own thriving, active network of communication. Household servants moved between different employers over the course of their careers, knew one another personally, and regularly exchanged news and gossip about the families they served and the various guests who passed through those households over time. A single notable blunder committed at one particular dinner table could easily become a quietly shared story, one that rippled steadily outward through the servants' halls of the entire city, eventually reaching other households and, in time, other prospective employers or hosts. Your reputation could, quite literally, be shaped in rooms you would personally never even see, by people you had barely consciously noticed throughout the evening. There was also, on top of all this, the matter of exactly how you personally treated the servants attending to you, which functioned as its own quiet, ongoing test throughout the meal. The truly well-bred guest acknowledged their service smoothly and courteously, without ever making an unnecessary fuss about it, neither ignoring the staff rudely nor over-apologizing to them, and drawing unwanted attention to their presence. Treating servants with careless contempt marked you, instantly, as coarse and poorly raised. Displaying flustered, visible awkwardness around them marked you, equally clearly, as someone entirely unaccustomed to being properly served in this manner. Even here, in these brief, seemingly minor interactions with the quiet figures standing along the walls, you were, in fact, being carefully measured and evaluated the entire time. So you sit at the glittering table, focused primarily on your utensils, your carefully avoided forbidden topics, and your endlessly unreadable hostess, while all around you an entirely silent, watchful staff observes your every single move with practiced, professional neutrality. They will say absolutely nothing to you tonight. Their faces will remain perfectly composed throughout the entire evening. But the story of exactly how you conducted yourself may well be told later, in a kitchen you will personally never once enter, and carried steadily outward through the great houses of the city in the days and weeks that follow. You are, it turns out, performing for a considerably larger and more attentive audience than you had ever fully realized. The finger bowl trap. And now we arrive at what is, without question, the single most famous trap of the entire evening, the finger bowl. Near the end of the meal, a small bowl of water is placed gently in front of you, sometimes with a delicate slice of lemon or perhaps a single floating flower petal resting on the surface. To the untrained and by this point thoroughly exhausted diner, this looks precisely like some kind of charming little refreshing drink. It is, emphatically, not a little drink. It exists purely for delicately rinsing your fingertips, one hand at a time, before quietly patting them dry on your napkin. History, as it turns out, is genuinely full of unfortunate souls who lifted that innocent-looking little bowl and drank straight from it, sealing their entire social fate in a single unfortunate gulp. You look at the bowl sitting in front of you. You look at the small floating lemon slice. You are, by this point in the evening, genuinely, desperately thirsty. Do not do it. Whatever else happens tonight, do not do it. Let's first understand what the finger bowl was actually designed for, since its underlying purpose was perfectly reasonable, even though its outward appearance was perfectly treacherous to an unsuspecting newcomer. After a long, elaborate meal that likely involved handling fresh fruit or other foods directly with the fingers at various points, a small bowl of water was provided so that guests could rinse their fingertips clean right at the table before the meal formally concluded. It represented a practical little courtesy, a simple way to freshen up before the evening drew to its eventual close. Sometimes a thin slice of lemon or a single flower petal floated in the water, partly for a pleasant fragrance and partly simply for visual elegance. The proper method of using the finger bowl was meant to be quiet, precise, and almost entirely unremarkable. You dipped your fingertips gently into the water, one hand at a time, rinsed them lightly for just a moment, and then dried them discreetly on the napkin resting in your lap. You did not plunge your entire hand into the bowl at once. You did not splash the water around, and you most certainly, under any circumstances, did not drink from it. It was meant to be a small, understated gesture, performed almost invisibly, entirely in keeping with the meal's general underlying principle that everything happening at this table should be accomplished with the absolute minimum of visible fuss. But to the uninitiated, and especially to a genuinely tired, thirsty guest many courses deep into an extraordinarily long meal, the finger bowl represented a perfect and genuinely deadly disguise. It looked, for all the world, exactly like a delicate small serving of water, or perhaps some kind of light refreshing beverage, complete with a floating garnish that only reinforced the illusion further. And so, the great, enduring legend of the finger bowl was born over the decades, the oft-repeated tale of the poor, unsuspecting soul who mistook it for an actual drink and lifted the small bowl directly to their lips, sipping from it in full view of an entire refined dinner table. Whether every specific version of that particular story is strictly, historically true hardly matters for our purposes tonight, because the underlying fear that story captured was entirely, genuinely real. To drink from the finger bowl was to reveal, instantly and quite unmistakably, that you did not know the accepted rules, that you had never previously attended a formal table quite like this one, and that you did not, in any real sense, belong among the people currently seated around you. It represented exactly the kind of single mistake capable of defining you socially. One small, unfortunate gulp capable of turning you into a cautionary tale, quietly whispered about at other dinner tables long after this particular evening had ended. There even exists, attached to this legend, a small, more gracious counterstory. The tale of a certain host who, upon witnessing a bewildered, uncertain guest accidentally drink from their own finger bowl, calmly and deliberately lifted his own bowl and drank from it as well, purely to spare his embarrassed guest from further humiliation in front of the assembled table. True or not in its specific details, that particular story has endured over the years precisely because it captures both the underlying cruelty of the trap itself and the genuinely rare kindness occasionally shown by the truly secure and confident. Most tables, however, offered no such quiet mercy to an uncertain guest. Most would simply watch silently, remember everything, and quietly judge accordingly. So the small bowl arrives at your place setting, water gleaming softly in the candlelight, a thin lemon slice floating temptingly on the surface, and every parched, exhausted instinct in your entire body urges you to simply lift it and drink deeply. You are genuinely exhausted by this point. You are genuinely thirsty, and it looks, more than almost anything else on this entire table, exactly like real relief. Do not do it. Dip your fingertips gently into the water instead. Rinse them lightly. Dry them carefully on your napkin. Resist the bowl entirely, and you will have successfully dodged the single most famous trap laid throughout this entire elaborate meal. Give in to that overwhelming thirst, even once, and you will be remembered afterward for exactly one single thing, and it will not, unfortunately, be your considerable charm. Part 14. The sweet courses. At long last, the sweet courses begin to arrive, signaling that the genuine end of this ordeal may finally be within reach. Puddings, delicate pastries, elaborately molded creams, and fashionable frozen ices are set carefully before you, often shaped into small edible sculptures far too beautiful in some cases to actually want to disturb with a fork. Which presents its own small problem, because you absolutely must eat your way through them correctly, using yet another dedicated utensil pulled from what feels like an endless supply. There is a specific spoon reserved for the ices, and a separate fork intended for the pastries, and confusing the two at this late, delicate stage of the meal, when actual victory finally seems within sight, would represent a genuinely tragic way to stumble at the very last hurdle. Fresh fruit might also make an appearance around this point, bringing with it the strange and remarkably specific challenge of peeling a pear using only a knife and fork, all while under close, continued observation from everyone around you. You are so very nearly there. Your corset, unfortunately, is considerably less confident about that particular assessment. Let's begin with the sweets themselves, because this was where the household kitchen made its final, dazzling impression of the evening. After the long, savory marathon of soups and fish and roasts and game that had come before, the meal now turned toward its sweet finale, a lavish array of puddings, creams, pastries, and various other confections. These were frequently elaborate creations in their own right, carefully molded, decorated, and presented with genuine artistry, meant to bring the entire dinner to a close on a note of real beauty and indulgence. They often looked, by this point, almost too lovely and carefully constructed to disturb with something as mundane as a fork. The frozen ices, in particular, represented a real highlight of the era's culinary fashion. Frozen creams and various flavored ices were considered genuinely fashionable and impressive throughout this period, requiring real skill and specialized equipment to produce properly, and therefore serving as one more quiet demonstration of the household's considerable resources. They arrived at the table cold and elegant, sometimes molded into decorative shapes, and came, naturally, with their own appropriately dedicated utensil, a small spoon specifically suited to the task of eating them gracefully, which brings us, inevitably, to the persistent tyranny of specialized utensils, still tormenting you even at this very late stage of the meal. The sweet courses arrived with their own dedicated forks and spoons, often laid out at the very top of your place setting, above the plate itself, rather than arranged to either side the way earlier courses had been. A dessert fork intended specifically for the pastries, a separate spoon intended for the ices and puddings, each with its own proper, specific use. Having successfully survived the entire meal up to this point, Choosing incorrectly now, during this final stretch, would represent a genuinely heartbreaking way to finally reveal yourself as an outsider, right at the very end. Then, if fresh fruit happened to appear on the table, came one of the most quietly diabolical challenges of the entire evening. Eating fruit politely at a truly formal table often meant not simply picking up a piece and biting into it directly, the way you might at home, but rather peeling and carefully cutting it using only a knife and fork. Managing to peel a pear or an apple neatly this way, reducing it methodically to tidy, manageable pieces without mangling the fruit entirely, or sending a slippery piece skidding unexpectedly across your plate, represented a genuine feat of hand-eye coordination. And doing it all gracefully, under the continued watchful eyes of the entire table, required real practice that you, quite understandably, almost certainly lacked. And through all of this final stretch, your body was steadily reaching its absolute physical limit. You had eaten your way through an enormous number of separate courses by this point, sealed the entire time into unyielding, restrictive formal wear. And now, even during this final sweet course, you were still expected to accept and taste additional food with exactly the same poise and outward restraint you had maintained since the very first oyster of the evening. The end was, genuinely, finally in sight. But the meal itself seemed determined to test you right up until the very last possible bite. So the beautiful sweets and elegant frozen ices arrive at your place, and you reach carefully for what you sincerely hope is the correct final utensil, quietly praying you have not fumbled this particular choice at the last possible moment of the entire evening. You navigate the pastry, the frozen cream, perhaps even a genuinely treacherous pear, using the very last remaining reserves of your steadily fatting composure. You are almost finally through this entire long ordeal, so close to the end now that you can practically taste it, and it tastes, mercifully, like sugar and quiet relief. Just don't celebrate too soon. There is still one more strange ritual left to come before the evening is truly finished. The ladies withdraw just when everyone at the table is finally, genuinely full, and the entire ordeal seems mercifully close to complete. The meal performs one last, genuinely bizarre maneuver. The hostess rises from her seat, and with her, every woman seated at the table stands as well and withdraws entirely from the dining room, leaving all of the men behind at the table. This was long-established tradition, a designated moment for the ladies present to retire together to the drawing room for coffee and quiet conversation among themselves, while the gentlemen remained seated at the table. If you happen to be a woman tonight, you must rise gracefully and glide out of the room along with the rest of the group, carefully timing your exit to match everyone else's movement. If you happen to be a man, you must stand politely as the women depart, and then settle right back down into your chair, realizing with a slight sinking feeling that this represents somehow yet another entirely separate phase of the evening still to come. The party, you're beginning to understand, is genuinely not over yet. The party, it seems, is never quite over. Let's understand this particular tradition a bit more fully, because it represented a long-established custom of formal dining throughout this era. After the meal proper had concluded, the hostess would signal the moment by simply rising from her own seat, and at this specific cue, every woman present would stand as well and leave the dining room together as a group, withdrawing typically to the drawing room elsewhere in the house. The men, by long-standing custom, remained behind at the table. It amounted to a formal, deliberate parting of the sexes, a scheduled division of the larger party into two entirely separate gatherings for a period of time before eventually reuniting later in the evening. The actual signal for this transition was subtle but ultimately unmistakable, and reading it correctly was considered genuinely essential. The hostess did not announce the coming withdrawal loudly or verbally. She simply rose from her chair, perhaps catching the eye of one or two other ladies nearby, and the assembled women were expected to notice this cue and rise along with her, more or less in unison. For a guest unfamiliar with the custom, this meant staying genuinely alert throughout the meal's final stretch for exactly this moment, standing promptly and gracefully when it finally arrived, and moving smoothly with the departing group rather than lingering awkwardly behind, or worse, failing to notice the cue entirely and remaining seated among the men by mistake. For the departing women, this withdrawal led naturally into its own softer, more relaxed social setting. In the drawing room, the ladies gathered together for coffee and easy conversation, a welcome chance to talk freely among themselves in a considerably more relaxed atmosphere, free from the rigid seating arrangements and carefully assigned dinner partners that had governed the meal itself. This was not, by any means, simply idle downtime. It represented its own distinct arena of ongoing socializing, where relationships were carefully maintained, fresh impressions were formed, and the ever-present currents of society continued flowing steadily along, simply in a different room, and in a somewhat different conversational key than before. For the men left behind at the table, the dining room itself transformed into an entirely different kind of gathering, one we'll explore in the next section. The important point for now is simply that the meal did not conclude the moment the last of the food had been served and eaten. Instead, the larger evening fractured deliberately into two separate configurations, the party splitting cleanly in two, each half continuing its own version of the evening before the two groups eventually reunited again later on. What had felt, moments earlier, like the genuine finish line turned out instead to be merely another quiet transition point. And so the imagined guest of tonight's story, having assumed the entire ordeal was finally drawing to a close, discovers instead that it is, in fact, still very much ongoing. There existed no clean, definitive ending point, no single moment where you could simply exhale fully and relax completely. This particular withdrawal introduced an entirely fresh layer of etiquette to carefully navigate, fresh timing cues to read correctly, and an entirely fresh social setting to somehow survive. Whether you followed the departing ladies to the drawing room or remained seated at the table among the men, the evening kept quietly generating new tests, one after another, long after you had genuinely assumed it must surely be finished by now. So the hostess rises from her chair, and in one graceful, coordinated ripple, the assembled women stand and glide from the dining room together, leaving the men behind to settle back comfortably into their chairs. If you happen to be among the departing ladies, you rise smoothly along with them, hopping fervently that your timing matches the rest of the group. If you happen to be among the remaining men, you stand respectfully as they leave, and then sit back down once again, realizing with a small, sinking feeling that yet another entirely new chapter of this long evening is only just now beginning. In the Gilded Age, it turns out, the meal itself never really ended in any conventional sense. It simply, quietly, changed rooms. Part 15. Port and cigars. With the ladies now gone, the men remain seated at the table, and the entire mood in the room shifts almost immediately into a low, comfortable haze of drifting cigar smoke and important-sounding conversation. This is where real business was often quietly conducted throughout the Gilded Age, where deals, opinions, and entire railway fortunes were passed casually around the table, along with the decanter itself, which, by strict and closely observed custom, was always slid to the left, and never once lifted directly across the table to hand to someone. If you happen to be a man tonight, badly out of your depth in this particular company, this represents an entirely brand new kind of danger, because the safe, pleasant, carefully neutral topics that govern dinner conversation now give way to considerably harder talk of markets, money, and business, and you are suddenly expected to hold genuine opinions on subjects you do not actually understand at all. You swirl your glass of port thoughtfully, buying yourself a moment. You nod at what feel like the right moments in the conversation, and you pray, with your entire remaining composure, that no one turns and asks you a direct question. Let's begin with the setting itself, because the atmosphere in the room changed instantly the moment the ladies departed for the drawing room. The dining room, which only moments earlier had been a place of careful, restrained, closely watched conversation, loosened noticeably into a more relaxed and distinctly masculine gathering. Cigars were lit around the table, filling the air with drifting smoke, and a fortified wine, most famously port, was brought out specifically for the men to enjoy together. The rigid conversational rules that had governed the earlier mixed dinner table relaxed just enough to permit certain kinds of talk that would have been considered entirely unwelcome in front of the ladies moments before. Now, the port itself came bundled with its own beloved, very specific ritual, one that trapped the unwary just as surely as any finger bowl had earlier in the evening. The decanter of port was passed carefully around the table in one single, consistent direction, traditionally always to the left, moving steadily from guest to guest so that each man present could fill his own glass before sending the decanter onward to his neighbor. You did not reach directly across the table for it under any circumstances, and you certainly did not simply hold onto the decanter for an extended period once it reached you. You served yourself a reasonable amount, and then passed it promptly along to your left, keeping the decanter circulating smoothly in its properly established direction. Breaking this small, seemingly minor ceremony, hoarding the decanter too long, or accidentally sending it the wrong way around the table, marked you out instantly among men who took this particular custom quite seriously indeed. The conversation itself, though, was where the truly significant peril lay for an outsider in your position, with the women now withdrawn to another room entirely. The surrounding talk often turned toward subjects considered generally unsuitable for mixed company, and in this particular era of ambitious tycoons and constant financial speculation, that frequently meant business, markets, various investments, and the ongoing making and moving of truly great fortunes. This represented the setting where actual deals were sometimes quietly advanced between interested parties, where genuine opinions on commerce and finance were exchanged freely, where the real underlying machinery of the moneyed world occasionally turned in full view, and you were expected, without exception, to participate as though you genuinely belonged among these men. For someone badly out of his depth, this represented an entirely fresh nightmare layered on top of everything that had come before. The comfortable, deliberately weightless topics that had governed the earlier dinner table, the opera, the pleasant weather, harmless travel stories, were entirely gone now. In their place came pointed, specific talk of business enterprises and financial earnings, delivered confidently by men who commanded genuinely enormous real wealth and clearly expected you to hold your own in the conversation. You could not simply confess your own ignorance outright, and you could not remain entirely silent throughout without appearing dull, evasive, or somehow unworthy of inclusion. You had to project the easy, natural confidence of someone who genuinely understood these complex financial matters, all while frantically hoping the conversation would never turn directly toward you and demand a specific, informed opinion. This entire interlude carried its own distinct test of composure, layered on top of everything you had already survived that evening. You had to handle your glass of port and your lit cigar with an appearance of practiced ease, pass the decanter correctly along to your left at the appropriate moment, contribute meaningfully to the ongoing conversation without ever overreaching your actual knowledge, and generally comport yourself as a man genuinely comfortable in the company of the powerful and wealthy. It represented the dinner's earlier social demands transposed into an entirely new key, smokier, looser, more relaxed on the surface, but ultimately no less watchful and no less quick to notice the man who simply didn't quite fit in. So you sit amid the slowly drifting cigar smoke, a glass of port held carefully in one hand, passing the decanter dutifully along to your left when it reaches you, nodding along to talk of markets and fortunes you do not, if you're being entirely honest with yourself, begin to fully understand. You swirl your port with the thoughtful, considered air of a genuinely serious man weighing important matters. You murmur vague, non-committal agreement at what feel like the appropriate moments. And you pray, above all else, that no one at the table turns directly to you and asks your personal opinion, because the moment you're forced to actually open your mouth on the subject, the entire carefully maintained illusion may come crashing down around you in an instant. The final departure eventually, mercifully, it finally becomes time to leave. And yes, even this final act of leaving comes bundled with its own careful set of rules to follow. You do not simply bolt directly for the front door the very moment you become physically able to do so, no matter how desperately your feet, your stomach, and your exhausted soul are quietly begging you to. Leaving too early quietly insults the hostess, while lingering too long afterward marks you out as someone who genuinely cannot read the room correctly. You must actively seek out the host and hostess before departing, offer them brief, genuinely gracious thanks for the evening, say nothing especially memorable in the process, and then retrieve your coat and your waiting carriage in one smooth, unhurried, entirely dignified exit from the premises. And naturally, the very next day established etiquette demanded that you send a formal thank you note or leave a proper card, thanking your hosts all over again for their hospitality. The dinner itself is finally, genuinely over. The associated paperwork, as always in this particular world, is decidedly not. Let's start with the matter of timing, because your departure was governed by essentially the same tyranny of finding the exact correct moment that had ruled your original arrival hours earlier. You could not leave the very instant the meal and its various aftermath activities had concluded, because bolting immediately for the door the moment you were physically able suggested, quite clearly, that you had merely endured the evening rather than genuinely enjoyed it. A quiet, unmistakable insult directed at your hosts. But you also could not overstay your welcome, lingering long after the natural, sensible conclusion of the gathering, because that marked you out equally clearly as someone who simply couldn't sense when a proper evening had reached its natural end. There existed, as always throughout this entire evening, a narrow, correct window for departure, and you were expected to somehow feel your way toward it instinctively. Then there was the actual manner of the farewell itself, which carried its own specific expectations. Before leaving the premises, you sought out the host, and especially the hostess, in order to offer your thanks and properly take your leave. This particular farewell, like virtually every other exchange throughout the long evening, was meant to be gracious but genuinely brief, warm in tone, but never allowed to linger too long. You expressed sincere gratitude for a delightful evening. You said something pleasant and appropriately forgettable in response to whatever they said back to you, and you did not monopolize your host's attention at this late stage, nor turn your final departure into some kind of extended, drawn-out production. You thanked them properly, and then you moved along toward the door. The actual physical mechanics of exiting the mansion called for exactly the same smooth, practiced composure you had been struggling to maintain throughout the entire night. Your coat, your hat, and any wraps were retrieved promptly by the waiting household servants. Your carriage was summoned from wherever it had been waiting outside. You made your way carefully toward the exit without ever appearing visibly rushed or flustered, gliding through these final moments of the evening with roughly the same practiced ease the entire occasion had demanded from you since the very first announcement of your name, hours earlier. Even now, at the very end of the night, you were still, quietly being observed by those around you. Even now, poise still genuinely mattered. But here is the part that reveals, perhaps more clearly than anything else, just how genuinely relentless this entire social world truly was. The underlying obligation did not actually end the moment you stepped out of the mansion's front door and into your waiting carriage. Established etiquette demanded that, in the days immediately following the dinner, you formally acknowledge your host's hospitality once again, typically by sending a proper written note of thanks, or by leaving a calling card at their home. This was never treated as some kind of optional, purely voluntary courtesy, but rather as fully expected, standard practice, a way of properly closing out the entire social exchange that the original invitation had opened weeks earlier. The dinner itself generated its own necessary follow-up correspondence, one final piece of the endless surrounding paperwork that governed this entire society. And in a real sense, this closing ritual mirrored the opening ritual of the whole evening perfectly. Your original entry into this particular gathering had begun with calling cards and carefully worded formal replies. The elaborate paper machinery required simply to be invited in the first place. And now, your eventual exit trailed off into more of exactly the same kind of correspondence. The follow-up note or card that properly, formally acknowledged the considerable honor of having been included at all. The entire affair, start to finish, was bookended by careful etiquette, wrapped from beginning to end in small, obligatory gestures that never quite allowed you to simply relax and consider the whole matter genuinely finished. So you locate your hosts one final time, offer your brief and appropriately gracious thanks, retrieve your coat from the waiting servant, and step out into the cool night air at exactly the right moment, neither too soon, nor too late, gliding away from the glittering mansion with the very last remaining reserves of your carefully maintained composure. You have, against considerable odds, survived the dinner itself. And yet, as your carriage pulls slowly away from the mansion and back out onto the quiet, dark streets of the city, you remember, with a small internal groan, that tomorrow morning you must sit down and properly compose a written note of thanks. Because in the Gilded Age, it turns out, even leaving a party correctly came bundled with its own homework assignment. Part 16, Reflection and Closing. So how did you do tonight, in this long-imagined journey through a single Gilded Age dinner party? Over the course of one single evening, you navigated an entirely invisible system of invitations, written in the secret coded language of folded calling cards. You strapped yourself into clothing built almost entirely for quiet suffering. You walked into a room full of strangers to the sound of your own name being announced loudly by a butler. You greeted a hostess who could have erased your entire social standing with a single unreadable glance. You marched, in careful ceremonial order, toward a table you couldn't fully read or understand. You survived somewhere around 20 separate courses and what felt like a small, steady lake of wine. You obeyed 100 silent, unwritten rules of conduct, most of which nobody ever bothered to explain to you directly. And somehow, against fairly considerable odds, you resisted the overwhelming temptation to drink from the finger bowl. Or perhaps, in your own imagined version of this evening, you did not manage quite all of that. Perhaps you reached for the wrong fork at some crucial moment. Perhaps you laughed a little too loudly at something during dinner. Perhaps you accidentally mentioned money in front of the wrong person. Perhaps you lifted that innocent-looking little bowl of lemon water straight to your lips without a second thought. Either way, welcome to a single night in Gilded Age high society, a world where the food never seemed to stop coming, where the rules were consistently merciless, and where genuine belonging turned out to be the one single thing that all of that vast accumulated money could only ever almost buy outright. Let's take a quiet moment to properly consider the sheer overall scale of what you were actually up against throughout this entire evening. This was never really a dinner in any sense you'd recognize from your own life today. It was an elaborate, genuinely hours-long endurance test, carefully disguised as an ordinary shared meal, governed by rules that touched absolutely everything, from the specific paper you were expected to reply on weeks earlier, all the way down to the exact direction in which you passed a decanter of port near the very end of the night. Every single stage of the evening, from the first calling card to the final thank you note sent days later, carried its own distinct etiquette, its own quiet opportunities either to succeed unnoticed or to fail in some way that would be remembered. And critically, nobody ever actually handed you the underlying rulebook. You were simply expected, somehow, to already know it all in advance. Consider, for a moment, what genuinely made survival possible for the people who actually belonged comfortably in this particular world. It was never really intelligence alone, or natural charm, or even sheer accumulated wealth by itself. It was, instead, A lifetime of careful training, absorbed so early in childhood and so thoroughly over the years that the entire elaborate performance eventually required no conscious thought whatsoever. They chose correctly among a dozen forks without ever really thinking about it. They sipped their soup in the proper approved direction purely out of long-established habit. They read the subtle turning of the table and the quiet rising of the hostess entirely instinctively, without needing to consciously watch for either cue. What genuinely terrified you throughout this imagined evening was, for them, simply their ordinary Tuesday night, rehearsed patiently since early childhood until it required absolutely no conscious effort at all. And consider, finally, what all of these countless individual rules were actually for in the first place, because that turns out to be the real, underlying revelation buried within the entire Gilded Age dinner party. The forks and the finger bowls and the long list of forbidden conversation topics were never really, at their core, about food, or basic table cleanliness, or even genuinely pleasant conversation. They functioned instead as an elaborate and entirely unspoken filter, a system carefully designed to separate those who had been properly raised within this particular world from those who had merely recently arrived into it with newly acquired money. The entire long evening amounted in the end to a test of genuine belonging, and that test was quietly rigged from the very start in favor of people who had already been taking it, in one form or another, their entire lives. This is precisely why money alone was never quite enough to guarantee real acceptance, and why so many of the newly wealthy families of this particular era poured such enormous effort into carefully learning these elaborate social rituals. You could, after all, build an impressive mansion on Fifth Avenue and fill it from floor to ceiling with genuine treasures. But if you drank from the finger bowl by mistake, or passed the port decanter in the wrong direction around the table, you had instantly revealed that your wealth was still relatively new, and your proper training still noticeably absent. The old, established families guarded their particular world not with literal walls or locked gates, but with etiquette itself, with what amounted to 10,000 tiny individual rules that money alone simply couldn't instantly purchase. Genuine belonging had to be performed flawlessly, night after night, and that kind of flawless performance took years, sometimes decades, to properly develop. So picture, one final time, yourself at the very end of this long-imagined evening, genuinely exhausted, thoroughly overworked, perhaps just slightly unsteady from all that carefully poured wine, having somehow stumbled your way through an entire evening deliberately designed to expose you at nearly every possible turn. Perhaps you performed well enough overall to be quietly invited back again sometime in the future. Perhaps, instead, you committed some small, seemingly unforgivable mistake that will quietly follow your reputation around the city for some time to come. Either way, you have now glimpsed, at least in your imagination, the strange, genuinely glittering, and often quite merciless machinery that powered Gilded Age high society. A world in which a simple shared meal could function as an actual battlefield, and where a single incorrectly chosen fork could meaningfully decide your entire social fate for months or years afterward. And that, in the end, is really why you likely wouldn't have survived a genuine Gilded Age dinner party had you actually been transported back to attend one. Not because you personally lacked sufficient wealth, or wit, or good intentions going into the evening, but simply because you had never been properly trained since early childhood for the 1,000 invisible tests quietly waiting for you inside that candle-lit dining room. You would have arrived that evening genuinely hopeful, navigated the first course or two purely on nerve alone, and somewhere between an incorrectly chosen fork and that tempting little finger bowl, you would have quietly, unmistakably given yourself away as an outsider. The truly wealthy made the entire elaborate performance look effortless throughout the evening. It never actually was. It was simply a lifetime of careful, patient practice, dressed up beautifully in silk, served elegantly on polished silver, and presented as though it required absolutely no effort at all. So there you have it, laid out across a single long evening. In the span of just one night, you decoded an invitation written in the secret, coded language of carefully folded calling cards. You laced yourself tightly into clothing specifically built to quietly punish the body wearing it. You walked into a room full of watchful strangers to the sound of your own name being formally announced. You sat down before more than a dozen individual pieces of silverware, arranged carefully like a small, gleaming army awaiting your inevitable mistakes. You survived roughly 20 separate courses and a slow, steady tide of carefully paired wines. You held your tongue throughout on every genuinely interesting subject that came to mind. You successfully dodged the tempting little finger bowl. And you passed the port decanter carefully to your left when your turn came, all while pretending, throughout the entire evening, that none of it required a single ounce of real conscious effort on your part. It was, without question, exhausting. It was, in many ways, genuinely absurd when you step back and consider it honestly. And yet it was also, somehow, considered by the people living it a perfectly lovely night out. There is something quietly wonderful buried within all of this, though, if you sit with it for a moment longer before drifting off to sleep tonight. These were, after all, simply people who happened to turn an ordinary evening meal into an elaborate form of theater, who built entire private palaces purely in order to eat dinner inside them, and who wrapped a fundamentally ordinary shared meal in 10,000 tiny individual rules, simply in order to prove, over and over again, that they genuinely belonged somewhere. It was, in many respects, genuinely ridiculous. But it was also, underneath all the corsets and the carefully folded calling cards, deeply and recognizably human. It represented this same endless, glittering effort to find some kind of secure place among one another. The same fundamental effort that all of us, in our own quieter, considerably less elaborate ways, continue making even now. So tonight, as you settle further into your own soft, comfortable bed, wearing whatever comfortable, entirely unstructured clothing you happen to prefer, take one final quiet moment to feel genuinely grateful for what you have. You can eat with whichever fork you happen to pick up first, without a second thought. You can drink from any glass you like, whenever you like. You can talk about absolutely anything at all over dinner, laugh as loudly as you genuinely feel like laughing, and leave the table whenever you personally feel like leaving, and no one watching will remember any of it forever. The Gilded Age was, in its own particular way, beautiful, and it was merciless, and it was, admittedly, just a little bit silly when you look back on it honestly. And you almost certainly would never have survived it. But you don't have to survive it. Not tonight. Tonight, you simply get to rest instead. So close your eyes now. Breathe easily. Let the candlelight from that imagined dining room slowly fade away into the darkness behind your eyes. Let the sound of clinking crystal grow fainter and fainter, further and further away, until it disappears completely. Good night.